faculties are, the cultural or religious faculties of that person are, that give them a sense of meaning in driving against that oppression, where the oppression itself could end up being the thing that they define themselves by and therefore feel powerful, versus someone in the other more more privileged environment actually having a much worse experience because they're completely spiritually devoid from it.
Of course, they want to control the flows. It's like with migration, it's like with other things. They want to control the flows of biological matter, they want to control the flows of humans, of human beings and so on. So these are kind of tools to further refine and economize the system of control, which could also be called a system of regulation, which sounds less triggering, but it's a system of population management. Make no mistake. And again, you can see that as sinister or as sort of less sinister.
This is the Panopticast. Conversations at the edge of freedom.
I think you'd agree, like the same way, any of the what important conclusion or position are you taking at the moment about COVID and everything that connects to it? What important position are you taking for which those professionals, for which the majority is on your side? If you think of masks, for example, right, or whatever.
Yeah.
Like anything, and that's that. Well, I'll let you answer.
I mean, I think there's a difference in some cases between what, even in some cases, a majority are saying, and what then the conclusions they're drawing from that, and the narrative around
the distance between that and the narrative is huge, especially at the moment.
So actually, for example, the majority of scientists are saying, because this data is available, that despite the fact that the Isle of Man, Ireland, Israel, there's another notable example, have some of the highest vaccination rates, they also have the highest infection rates. So, I don't know whether...
And the opposite's true, but like with Africa or whatever, that there's...
And there's cases, some with the lowest that also have the lowest. So I mean, maybe not the majority.
I think sorry to interrupt, but the Scandinavian countries that I don't know which, is it Denmark and so, a couple of Scandinavian countries have now dropped all. I shouldn't be repeating that. I've just heard it in passing, so I don't know if it's right or not. But there's one or two of them.
I'm sure. I imagine Sweden probably has.
No more restrictions whatsoever.
Yeah,
they're doing all right.
Yeah, but I guess I guess that brings in all sorts of the variables.
All right, ignore that and stick to where you were.
But just with that one thing, so I think the majority of scientists recognise that. That's, maybe they're not kind of all of them consciously aware of that. I don't know, but
how do you know they're recognising it? Where's the evidence that they're recognising it rather than choosing to just not look at that?
Yeah, well, I think it's possible that they're choosing not to look at that, but it's not a disputed fact. Do you know what I mean? There are certain things that are disputed, like are masks efficacious or not, and or what is the efficacy?
As an example, the majority would be against you on that.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think. I get your point. The point is, most of them are against me on all those things. But
and the utility
I'm trying to find examples where they're not.
Yeah.
But even where they're not, I think the conclusions that are being drawn, or the omission of that into the narrative,
to the other things there, But if and surely like the utility of a specialist's knowledge, the total utility of a specialist's knowledge, is the degree to which it actually gets out of their brain and gets into the hands of the society, right? And if it's blocked by narrative and these other things, those things have to be.
Well, exactly.
Included
but that was my point at the beginning, wasn't it? What are the, knowledge and information are only as good as the institutional conditions in which they're produced. And I think those institutional conditions can be corrupted or impaired in various different ways. One, I guess, is sort of at the input level.
Yeah.
You know, and we can go through it all, you know, what actually gets funded to be looked into in the first place, which is just a sort of selection bias. It doesn't say anything about actually then the content that comes out, you know, but then also which of those things that are funded in the first place actually then get published, because if the results then turn out to be not favourable to the funders, there are pressures not to do that. I mean, I don't want to try and listen because they're probably so multivariant, but then I think there's also, which we see in a lot of now at the sort of almost at then the output level, which is the narrative thing. Once an issue has become so politicized, it's almost at the interpretive level that certain things. So it's not necessarily that the information's in there. And I think that's one of the kind of conservative things. It's like, what is being highlighted here? What is being integrated in the synthesis, and what is being excluded from the synthesis? You know, there is the fact that I think certain things are not being at the input level, not being explored. Like, you know, why did it take so long to look at therapeutics and, you know, specific therapeutics? And you can say, okay, well, there incentives around that because certain solutions to this, you know, quote unquote problem are very lucrative. Others are not. You know, like you said earlier on, why was there not a big push for vitamin D, which is, you know, and just increasing the health of populations, because that is such an important variable. And especially now we're getting into the 2 year. You could have said at the start, oh, well, you know, 6 months, what can be done in 6 months? But now we're in like 2 years, 2.5 years. It's almost like a never ending crisis. Because, you know, the vaccines aren't sort of, they're leaky, you know, at best. So So yeah, there's so I would have to say, because I think it's problematic to say, you know, the scientific community is not saying these things. It's almost at the level of political interpretation, by which I don't necessarily just mean interpretation by politicians, but interpretation by politicized agencies of the scientific establishment.
At which point, how useful is the scientific establishment at that point? It needs to be. It's like saying.
Well, it's pretty good when things aren't politicized, isn't it? Or have economic implications.
Totally, and that's why I think that whole thing, everything you just said, is the exact caveat I would want attaching on to any discussion of specialists being inherently specialized and useful. It correlates perfectly with if someone said to me. Like if someone said to you, journalism is the most important thing, that's a true statement. Other than maybe education, it's probably the most important thing, like in a democracy. But instantly, as soon as you hear journalist in our generation, in the way we've grown up and the way the world works, you're cynical instantly, right? Because it's like a profane trade in a way, almost, right? The person doing it right is the exception. When I hear, and maybe it's a bias, and maybe it's just previous sort of programming in a way, but when I hear specialist, it has a similar effect on me to journalist because of the same way that
It's
the ist, I think. I don't like ists. I like isms. Isms are all right, but ists.
But journalism's all right.
Get right under me. Journalism's all right, but yeah, it's the ist. I think it's that
it's the collective's fine, but the individuals.
We have bias. We do have biases, but like you'd agree that it's the same thing applies. Journalism's only as good as the journalist, right? And only as good as the journalist and the system that they're operating in. It's almost identical to someone who's a specialist or a technician, right? But would you admit that you would bristle more at journalism, a journalist being spoken of as being in some way someone who should be trusted and something that's high in and of themselves? You wouldn't. You'd be like, you'd have an aversion to it. I'm just correlating those two things together. I'm just saying, I think the right specialist.
I think I'd agree. You know, yeah, I mean, I don't think I'd have had. I don't think I necessarily would have had that bias in advance. I don't think I'm like, oh, specialists are good. I'm, as you know, Mr. kind of political economy about this. It's like I know.
But you wouldn't have would you say you? Sorry to interrupt you. Yeah. You wouldn't have. I'd say we all have a skepticism or an optimism towards a given thing. And I admit that I've got a skepticism towards both journalists and specialists.
Yeah.
And it's probably, I think I could probably, the truth would probably be further away up from my bias. But I would suspect it's not that far, right? Would you say that just honestly, like inherently, just your response if you hear the word, you know, like because a lot of this is quite subconscious.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
You know,
yeah,
like,
someone says, "Oh no, it's a specialist."
Yeah, or it's
Rather than if
or you
someone
meet
said, "Oh, no, it's a
someone, you're
journalist."
introduced to someone who's just studied something for 40 years. You're instantly like, right, I've got respect for this guy, and you should have, because there's things that commands respect for, and the people who do that in the right way and conduct themselves right are literally the kind of apotheosis of human intellect, as far as I'm concerned. They're as good as it gets.
Yeah,
But I think other
I,
people get carried on their coattails that aren't quite to that standard.
Yeah, and I know myself that, you know, those things that I have studied in more depth have always been much more complicated than I would have been able to even conceive at the outset.
Anything in life, it's the metaphor works across.
Exactly, because you know, in a way, it's a conceptual thing. You know, it's like, just let's take economics, right? Everyone knows the word economics, right? And then there's gradations there, you know, all the way down to someone who's studied it all their life, who knows all the different schools, all the kind of arguments for and against those different schools, the assumptions and values underpinning them, and you know, and etc., etc., etc. So you know, the more you look at something, the more it, you know, fragments and complicates and becomes so yeah. I mean, for that reason, yeah, if someone said, "Oh, I'm a specialist in X," yeah, again, it comes to that authority point. You know, they prima facie have increased authority in that area, just as a double dan black belt, I guess. Sensei tells you something about, you know, that martial art. You probably do well to kind of listen to them. But
it depends on where you relate.
But then if the problem is, we live in worlds of institutions and of, you know, states and capital and all these things that because, make no mistake, it is authority. You know, look at what's going on now. And other forms of authority, the things we would normally just call power, although both obviously have power. I mean, like, knowledge is power, and, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And but it's absolutely no surprise that in a system of massive inequalities and of conflict, political conflict, and you know, those seeking to take advantage of others, essentially, what would you do with those that hold that expertise and knowledge? You want it working for you. You know, it's like I was.
And who's got the capacity to hire those people in biggest numbers?
Of course, like, I was listening to a talk that the guy who I used to study under at Manchester did, you know, to a group of students, and it just happened to be recorded on YouTube. And one of they were talking about the way in which they were first talking about how Indigenous community is often sort of romanticised and also homogenised. You know, it's like there's the community that's fighting the corporate, you know, the person building the dam, or the one that wants to clear the woodland, or you know, and pay them off or whatever. And, you know, a point that one of the students made, and they were doing some research, I think, in a South American country, said was, you know, actually there are heterogeneity within those communities. There are very different positionalities of different people, and we treat the chief and we just say, oh, there's a community, there's an homogenous view, right? But the point being is, what he said was, these companies are hiring some of the best anthropologists in the world. Now, if you say anthropologists, you kind of think, oh, these people study human societies, like, you know. Often I think of, certainly of ethnographers as doing like some really interesting work. You know, I've read some of the books. It's, you know, it's fascinating, you know, stuff. But these people are being paid to go into these communities with the objective of interpreting on the behalf of the company, where are the leverage points? How do we leverage the best result for us so that we pay the least in order to get these people the fuck out of here, so that we can exploit this land, dig the coal up, or whatever it might be we want to do. So, you know, these expertise and knowledges, and then there's the actual production of knowledge, as we've just sort of gone through, in terms of what gets paid for, you know, what happens if the results are not in line with the, you know, the priorities of the funders, you know, and that's only the most superficial, I think, sort of rubbing of the surface. And many people have written about this. I mean, the institutions are in crisis, you know, and I think that includes the education and scientific institutions.
The question I was going to ask you, actually, it kind of relates to what you're saying before. We have a similar position on that. What's going on now is is an expansion of state control in an authoritarian direction for whatever reason, whether it's as a result of an organic situation or whatever else, but just capitalising on circumstances, right? Yeah, if you're going to argue that we've got, not even an event 2 or 1 level thing, you know, like, but if you're going to argue that we've got a global expansion of authoritarianism, how is that possible without believing that loads of academics are in on it, taking money for it, whatever, being convinced one way or another, turning a blind eye or whatever it is?
This is the $1 million question, isn't it? I think. I mean, one level of. I mean, it's got to be. I think. There's got to be multiple answers to that. There's not like. I don't think there's one answer to that. I mean, one starting point is that the voices that would normally counter that are being silenced or are silencing themselves for the various reasons we've spoke about previously. So it is socially unacceptable now
The narrative doesn't
within
allow for
professional institutional settings, right? So within the world of influence, right? So if you work for and there are many mechanisms that have caused this. So you'll recall, it's not so dissimilar. And I'm not taking a view on the issue. I'm just using it as an example. But you recall with the Black Lives Matter movement that if anyone said, there was a case of some guy who worked for a youth charity. I mean, he seems on the face of it. Obviously, I don't know the guy. I was reading an article about him, but he seemed like a very altruistic, very kind of equality, diversity, and inclusion conscious. You can't not be working in the space, I don't think. And I think he made some kind of slightly critical point about how that was heading, and he got sacked by the board of directors because it drew some attention. And you can see the logic from the board of directors. They might have thought this guy's a good guy.
This is the same thing that goes on in academic circles.
Yeah,
also,
and
right?
it goes in, it goes in every, in every circle, right? So I think there's all of that. So there's the self-censorship because there's that environment. There's the actual censorship, whereby the institution that you are working for wouldn't allow you to do that.
YouTube, Google.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be allowed to say something full stop. You'd actually be prevented from saying it.
Yeah, I'll look what happened to that chap that we, Mark.
Google guy. Is that you're on about the guy?
No, I'm on about the New York, the Media Studies New York University guy, Mark Crispin Miller. Yeah, he works and stuff. So I mean, I know he was kind of, talking about what would be considered sort of fairly fringe things, but he was, for example, when he told to his students, well, read the studies on mass, and then his propaganda course, his institution said you're not doing that course. So I think so there's and that that's censorship. That's censorship. Yeah, exactly, the irony. So I think that's a really important. Now it doesn't explain all of it by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a really important starting point for people to understand how, because that's how influence operates at a micro level. They think, oh yeah, someone's got to be handing over an envelope, or someone's got to be like, I'm in on a alternative view. No,
we'll kill your kids
just
if you do it.
all the incentives are driving in a particular direction. Then you get in that context a degree of sort of. It's easier just to think that thing. It's easier then to have the cognitive biases to say, all right, I'm not listening to these bits of information that are emerging because I just, even subconsciously maybe even, but I just know that's not good. That's not what's going to service the, the thing. And especially once you're committed to the narrative, you're committed to, this is extraordinarily dangerous. Everything is at this cost, right? So there's that. There's also the fact, I think, that particular, all this is stuff that I'm saying now is, independent of any notion of conspiracy. This is all just, I do think, kind of organic, group think and cognitive.
Psychology, it's just
psychological things. There's also the fact that I think again, without adding any, sinister malfeasance to this, there's also the fact that, okay, this is an issue of a virus. We'll turn to the epidemiologists and the virologists, and to the extent that they are the sort of originators, and I shouldn't say there because there's all sorts of exceptions, but like you were saying earlier, a narrow purview of their training on, how do you manage viral outbreaks. Again, there's, I'm not saying they've done it even, because there was manuals on how to do it that they completely threw out, but, there's that aspect that, okay, take all of that sort of self-censorship into account, then take the fact that the original narrative was driven by a very narrow field, which wasn't taking into account all sorts of other considerations, not doing that type of polymath kind of sort of synthetic view of things and calibration. So I think, that's a relevant sort of point. Then I think, what shocked me was the extent to which what on the face of it is a relatively decentralized society, first and foremost, it's a market. I mean, we live generally in a market society, which by its nature is not a Stalinist planned economy where sources of authority, are clearly centralized, information's controlled by by the control of sort of state media and all the rest of it. So to at least a significant extent compared to that extreme, there are diverse centers of power, and that makes it, again, that feeds into that person's point, how can there be sort of consistency across that? But actually, one thing that sort of surprised me, I think, or at least became evident to me in a way that it hadn't before, was what? Like with the COVID situation, was how quickly organisations down the food chain, essentially, you have the apex organisations, which includes national states, it includes the United Nations, it includes the European Commission, it includes some of the really big influential think tanks that convene those spaces, like the World Economic Forum and so on. Actually, how effective they are, especially within the context of crisis, right? Because that's the other really important thing. We're not talking about a narrative about something in general being controlled. We're talking about a narrative that is underpinned by crisis that is, not necessarily metaphorically, well, it is metaphorically, but it has the kind of war metaphor underpinning it, i.e. there's a major enemy that needs concerted, coordinated, coherent, consistent response. That has sort of snapped all these different institutions into that kind of war mentality, and of course the first victim of war is truth. And then, under that pretext, all sorts of things that pre the COVID crisis were, to some extent at least, intended as an institutional structure to mitigate against this kind of consolidation of this kind of singular sort of interpretation, lack of debate, etc., etc. Like, don't quote me on the specifics, but I remember reading that, Ofcom's guidance were changed. All these emergency powers have actually been able to be implied. I know that, for example, I think, the Atlantic Council and others, the influence it's had on the social media platforms that were already engaging in forms of kind of censorship and obviously algorithmic kind of biasing of information flows and so on, under a war footing, under the context of this global catastrophe, power has been able to exert itself. And again, we don't even have to get into the realm of like the motivations of that power, just in a sort of abstract sense. If at some point that is the objective, like ignore the belief and ignore the motivation underpinning that objective. If that becomes the objective, it's quite easy to see how things become locked into that.
Yeah, and in an information.
Now that even none of that even explains half it, I don't think. But it starts to kind of like help
illuminating it in just recognizing how far you'd have to go to actually properly illuminate. Like you can talk about it like that for a little while, and there's no clangers in there, right? That's all like a coherent analysis of that, and It does nothing. You know, like when you think of it, when you think of how much more there are, how much more there is to known and unknown, like to properly dial in that.
But it's a really good starting point. I think it probably explains 50 or 60% just to pluck a figure out of it. I think you can't underestimate how it is the herd. It's like saying.
Well, I was just going to say.
It's like saying, why did all these? I mean, I hate to use the sheep because I'm not saying it in a. You know, I don't want to. I think it's really pejorative language. I'm saying it as myself. You know, as the human species. You know, in the way that we are. You know, biologically geared for good reason to not want social censure, to want peer recognition and reward.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say at the beginning. Like,
and so you wouldn't. Sorry, but just to finish that quickly, you wouldn't say, "Oh, how did all these sheep move in one direction?" Or how did that flock of geese all kind of? Because that's stigmergy, right? That's how this stuff works.
I come back to this almost. This is one of those, you know, like subjects and responses that I've got to kind of restrain when it comes to me, because it seems to be my response to so much.
You love the biological
psychology. Yeah, I do, and it's just we've got the fact that it's the unexamined factor. You know, if we were all going around saying, "Oh, we've figured it out now," because we have actually, like between only 3 or 4 good thinkers over the last 100 years, we do know that everyone's full of shit. We do know that we're deluded about all the things that we're deluded about. If we were cognizant of that, if there was there should be a temple, there should be a religion based on us dealing with this shit fast, because it's the fundamental, it's what underpins all of human evolution, for us to see where we're full of shit. Because people don't. Because people don't, and it's almost celebrated, like. Yeah, like you.
Yeah, the system is structured to perpetuate and enhance the degree of delusion.
And and the data it's there. It exists to show that that's the state of affairs with us all. And there's not only is there no concerted effort to undermine it, but then we're all carrying on like, we're all like fully, cognizant, switched on beings that are really, with the decisions we're making are based on normal things. Whereas actually, all those people in those institutions, it's almost depressingly simple, in my opinion, that all those people in all those institutions, they don't need to keep quiet. They don't need to turn a blind eye. They don't need to be paid off. They don't even need to see. They just need to have what they've got, which is the deepest subconscious desire to feed the children, to not upset the apple cart too much, and it doesn't matter even if it's some of the worst idealists, some of the greatest idealists can't compete with, the 70% of their faculties in the subconscious that are saying, we need to eat, and you really are going to throw this career away? We were at university for 12 years, man. There's no getting. We don't even know the degree to which that rules the planet, rules the social order, and I think as soon as you're,
we can suspect it's pretty high.
Great.
Yeah.
If it's 50, if you can assume it's 51%. If you're an alien and went to visit a planet and you said, what's weird about these people, 51% of their psychological processes, they're oblivious to it. They don't know.
Oh, well, it's more than that. They
of course
know
it is,
more
but
than
I'm
that.
saying...
I think they know.
Oh, it's a lot more.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying
It's
is,
like
even
90,
if someone's...
99 or
I'm
90.
saying 51 for the purpose of saying just 1% over half, right? For someone to say 51% of their internal faculties, they're oblivious to them, and they are driving their realities on a day-to-day basis in ways that they don't see. And then if you said, who's got free will here, or who's driving this, you'd say, well, whatever's going on in this subconscious, clearly, and the subconscious is being driven by what? Then it gets complicated, because it's not even just the case of we're all just being driven in that way. We're not all just. It's not just that it's the way we function, but then you get the multiplier effect of, it is known that we function that way, as we know through. You don't have to get too weird about it and start talking about mind control. Just talk about Edward Bernays and propaganda and all the rest of it. We know how people they are just this swaying mass of meat that'll just respond to some really trivial prompts.
Can we start layering this up a bit more? I'm enjoying this.
Layering it?
Well, I think we said we might have got to 50% of the explanation. Can we just kind of keep going and see how? Do you know what I mean?
How do you mean?
With other sort of
derail...
explanatory variables that are contributing to that original question you asked. How can this coordination be taking place?
Yeah. So I mean, how do you need? Let's. But to finish that point, it's almost comical. Like,
but there's something that's got to set the train going.
Yeah. But all I'm saying is that last thing, that psychological factor, like to need more than that. And let's do it. Let's unpack it. But to need more, it's like as soon as you know that, if people.
Well, I think you'd have to explain, because that's a generic explanation that could explain anything. It could have been the opposite, couldn't it? It
explains that we are driven to service our own needs and the needs of our children. Yeah. And maybe our wife.
And in this case, what we're saying is that conforming to the narrative does that, especially when it's very politicized, and there's all sorts of disincentive. But the question as to why is this the narrative? It doesn't explain that, does it?
Why is this the narrative?
Well, I mean, some of the things I said sort of contribute to that. In terms of and again, very innocuous ones around saying, okay, well, it becomes the purview of this specialized group that have a very myopic view, and that was a kind of common argument. Why it's politicians' job to assess the broader values and so on, but it was sage that
ties back in perfectly to exactly what we're saying in terms of we've got a subconscious psychological drive to defer to an alpha. There's especially among men. Yeah. But I think culturally, like if someone's got it, if there's a savior to turn up and rescue you, but you want to do that anyway. So that feeds back.
But people on the other side of the aisle would say, would be using exactly the same argument to criticise, say, Trump and Bolsonaro or whatever. Those people that at least originally with Trump were, or even Johnson originally, was sort of going, take it on the chin or whatever. That's the alpha male.
They know that the mechanism works, but it's used on both sides. Just in
exactly.
On all sides.
So the mechanism. So I think as I said, like that I think is a really good basis to answer that specific question around the collusion and coordination point, because it's like actually I think the response is to say you probably don't realise how little direct collusion is required to have a very coordinated activity at that level, certainly.
Because we're unaware of a lot of our responses and the basis for
we're also we're driven by huge levels of affect in terms of there's a phrase called stigmergy, which is it explains, it's the scientific explanation or the name given to the explanation for why for the hive mind properties. So ants are the best one. They act in extraordinary degrees of concert for the collective good. But individually they are, they're not very sophisticated entities, but as a collective they act in, very sort of sophisticated ways in solving problems and, and dealing with threats and so on. And basically what, that's a system of pheromones, predominantly that are released that trigger, various different actions and responses. And the same applies across the animal kingdom, in a different way, as I said, with
perhaps with us.
Well, exactly, yeah, absolutely. But with the way in which, so it's when you see, in a way, you see these forms of beautiful order without planning. It's like when you see flocks of geese. Each one is responding to a signal next to it. And it doesn't have to understand. It doesn't have to know that there's the formation or anything.
And what's interesting but peculiar in this is that people are actually capable of that. You can see there's some really good stuff on this, like when you watch like a crossroads in Bangkok, where they have traffic lights, but there's a lot less control on tight streets than there are in the West, right? And you watch the way people just fucking deal with it. It's hilarious. You realise it's closer. It's not quite what those seagulls do, but it's
Yeah,
way
it's
closer
close.
to that than anything you've seen.
Yeah, and if you
people.
zoom, if you had a sort of, if you had your drone thing and you zoomed out, you'd be like, my God, that's like a beautiful orchestra being conducted by but there's no conductor. It's all just a micro influences.
Tiny responses to tiny cues, whether it's pheromonal or visual or whatever, and to achieve a level of order that seems inconceivable when you're just doing what we normally do day to day, which is respond in this really clunky way to whatever's going on.
Yeah, and how do people act? I think you can then sort of look at that, and obviously we're moving into different levels of complexity in terms of the system. It's not just in the case of the cars example, or the road traffic thing, that is sort of visual cues, which is not a million miles different from the birds flocking.
We assume,
but when you move to the level of social and cultural interaction, it's much more complicated, obviously, and emotive and so on.
Emotional
but everyone knows, and we've talked about this. It's obviously not a profound comment at all. Everyone understands the effects of peer pressure. Everyone knows how difficult it is to speak out about certain things. Everyone also knows how uncomfortable it is when you move into sort of realms of symbolic interaction amongst, say, different classes. Like if I was to go to the Bullingdon Club or whatever, I would feel extremely uncomfortable. Not just because I would look at them and think, God,
you'd be fine.
No, but you would though, wouldn't you? If you were wanting to integrate, I would be fine, probably because I'd be like,
fuck this.
Yeah, we'll look at these sort of, whatever. So you could say that at a certain age or with a certain degree of sort of self-confidence or whatever, you would not be necessarily swayed by that, but you would, in the situations where you do want to ingratiate yourselves, but you're out of sync with all those subtle cultural cues that are kind of, it's not you couldn't articulate. You just know. It's like the phrase "fish out of water." There's, you're not intuitively moving and responding in a way which is built on those cues.
And everyone
but
knows
they are all micro
cues.
cues. Yeah, they are all like and so the whole world is operating on it. So that's definitely a sort of important explanatory variable. But the thing that none of that at this level explains is why one direction rather than the other. And I think the other thing I said in the sense that you could say, oh well, that was the same for maybe sort of the Bolsonaro position. You get a strong man like setting the triggers or the signals or the virtues in different direction, and everyone will kind of go in that direction.
But some of it's inherent, some of it's
well, it's all probably inherent, but I guess
I mean some of it can't be changed.
Well, I'm saying why this response, right? Because our position is this is a unreasonable, abnormal, unjustified, misguided, whatever word you want to use, sort of response, and it's one that now all the weight seems to be behind. So
what? So let's unpack that. Let's focus in on what we're talking about, what we were saying before. I think because this thing now, it's just seemed to me more and more. First of all, it seemed to me more and more like the conversation everybody's having. At least everybody that I've got enough respect for, the people who are actually having a conversation, they're not just repeating. It comes down to this, whether it's the Austria now saying, obviously they've done the vaccinated lockdown, and now they've already done
the unvaccinated.
The unvaccinated only lockdown.
Yeah.
And now I've only seen this at one source, so I'll need to.
No, they are saying they're going to mandate vaccines.
But I know they're set to mandate. I know according to that one, I think according to that one link that they're set next year with a date that they're going to mandate.
I'm pretty sure that's kosher.
Yeah, and it's going to be fines, and if you can't pay the fines, it's going to be jail. And that's Austria now. Germany figuring out whether they want to follow suit. At that point,
and already segregating.
And then everything that's going on in Australia and everything else. So
but let's say that internment camps, military taking people to internment camps.
For only being in the vicinity of
a contact of someone who's tested.
Yeah.
Positive. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're there. That's where we're at. And at that point, sitting in the UK, it's kind of...
And Johnson said, just as well, Johnson's
Yeah.
saying we need a national conversation about mandatory vaccines.
Yeah.
Right?
So you've already had the cue. And even if you hadn't had that, even if he hadn't said that, sitting in the UK and saying, oh, well, that's Austria, would be just deluded now. Like, that's this is, if it needs to be taken that seriously, right? With this developing narrative of the legitimacy of forcing someone to receive a medical procedure, an untested, a largely untested medical procedure against their will, despite there being potential negative consequences. The narrative that's unfolding, that's now a normal topic of conversation. That's a discussion we should have, and it's something that's even credible to even discuss. Against that backdrop, I found myself for the first time in 2 years, as long as it's been going on, kind of on the back foot with this ICU thing. Like with everything else, I've always felt like I could just say, well, here's that data and here's this data, and the best you're going to say to me is that all I'm saying is I'm presenting counter data and saying this is up in the air. So first, do no harm. Let's back off. Let's not assume anything or try and tell other people how to live. And it's been at the minimum, I think a lot of it I could argue a case that I had on the more solid position, but I could always say you have no right to tell me when I've got this that you are definitely so right that you should be able to trample on my sovereignty or whatever. In this situation, with this ICU thing, I found myself in complicated territory because as soon as somebody's saying, all the arguments that I've been putting forward. Not even arguments, just almost dismissive rebuttals when I'm saying, the vaccine doesn't prevent transmission. The only thing it's doing is lessening the symptoms. And it almost makes you arrogant, thinking that you're almost like, it's so ridiculous. All it's doing is lessening symptoms. There could never be a purpose to get behind some of the shit people are getting behind. Until that simple factor of, well, the ICUs are overrun. They're all unvaccinated people, reportedly. All unvaccinated people. Countless, doctors coming forward and saying, I'm at my wit's end, I'm losing my patience with these unvaccinated people, the system's collapsing.
Is that happening?
Right, so that's okay. Point one to come back to. First of all, that's what that's what I was saying. That's all I had actually to hold on to for a little bit of the time I've been thinking about this. First of all, that needs to be very carefully unpacked because there are narrative. Just to quickly do the small thing on it. And it feeds perfectly back into what we've just been discussing. The assumption that many doctors, and I would assume it's many, I know someone personally who I trust, who knows someone personally who he's certain wouldn't lie to him, that works on an ICU and says this is insane, and she's like tears in her eyes, and this is his report via her. There's tears in her eyes, and she's devastated by what she sees going on. Now, at the moment, on one hand,
unvaccinated people being
the problem on these ICU wards, right? Now, first of all, that's it's difficult and this is probably what triggered me. It's like, okay, this is a person I know and I trust his opinion enough to trust his opinion of this person. So I'm like, I need to unpack this a little bit. And the only answer I had in the moment on that one was saying, well, we're in the narrative, coming back to what you were saying a minute ago, the narrative's so powerful now that there can be a lot of things that would push very honest people to not necessarily to maybe step outside their normal sphere of morality, in terms of if you knew for a fact in your narrative we are about to face an absolute catastrophic destruction of the health system, and you look at your ICU and it's only half filled, but it's more filled than normal, as it probably would be right now, and you see it growing and you think, I haven't got time, I'm not going to let this get to that point. You would validate internally, possibly, or someone may very well validate the moral justification to just be a part, to push this narrative a little bit harder and faster than you should, and be saying to people, look, it's terrible, and saying it's worse than it is, because you genuinely believe this will save lives, you doing that. This is you're caught in a situation where literally lying could be, the most sort of noble thing to do under the circumstances. I'm not saying that's the case with this person. I'm not saying that's the case with this person at all, but all I'm saying is that in the moment, that was the only thing I could think, well, this is counter. in some ways to some of my presuppositions as it stands, but that's all I've got. And it set me thinking, you know. I thought, well, that's a real silver bullet argument. So let's assume now that person isn't lying, and none of all these other people are lying, and let's assume.
And even if they were, it's a good hypothetical to test.
It's a good, yeah, exactly. It's a good thing to go through anyway. And I lean towards the likelihood that if this is being said in those numbers, then I'm not saying it means every ICU in the country is filled. Maybe it's just some that are extremely filled, while others are still sitting empty.
I don't think they are at the minute.
Right. Well, I don't know. This is something to go to. I can't say either way. Yeah. But for the purposes of this, I thought, well, we'll assume that the reports are right, and that if we're not at breaking point, we're approaching breaking point. Things are getting really bad, and they're going to get there really quick, right? And this is something that's completely within my conception of reality. That I believe, I don't disbelieve the fact that the vaccine lessens symptoms, right? Like, it makes perfect sense. So if the vaccine lessens symptoms and all these vaccinated are clogging up the gears, at that point, when someone sits across the table from you and says, "So, you're not having your vaccine. You could end up in there, and there's all these people with cancer or whatever else. All the people that beds are being cleared for now. Deaths are being caused directly by your not being on the team, basically, right?" Now, I don't get me wrong. I didn't sway for a second. Like, my not infallible, my quite shitty argument, the fastest thing I could sort of bring forward is still sufficient, and that's that and I've learnt a little bit and expanded it about beyond after this, but just to say where I was at the start of it, my position that the existing within a social order where there's an expectation of healthcare, it would be a more sensible, or at least it'd be less ridiculous to say to me, okay, you relinquish your healthcare, you don't get to go to a hospital if you get sick, than it would be to say we are going to force vaccinate you, or we're going to even start to discuss that, at least on the rate where it could be very quick if you see what's happening in Austria, right? So me relinquishing healthcare, I'm ready to do that. I'll take that. But I won't take forced vaccination. So instantly there's an argument straight away. But there's a lot more besides, right? I was in a bit of a sort of conundrum about it, and I talked to a few people to say, like, what's your thoughts on this? And the arguments are great once you unpack it. But it's the point here, before I go further with this is the point. That is a very silver bullet argument that in this day and age of short, snappy media slogans and things that get out there fast, could persuade a million people. In the same way that I was kind of arrogantly almost persuaded by oh my God, it just lessens symptoms. I would have probably made the statement at some point in the last 6 months, if someone had asked me, I'd say, that's meaningless. It's totally meaningless. Other than in certain individuals, compromised demographics and whatnot. But it's not meaningless. This shows you a good example of how something that seems meaningless can end up being completely meaningful. So the reasons why it's not, like, in the moment it seems like something that's a slam dunk. It seems like something that from their side, it seems like a silver bullet argument. And as a result of that, there can be a lot of people just passing that kind of that slam dunk response, that tweet that has people going, oh, well, how could I possibly argue with that? The unvaccinated are definitely wrong on this one. They need to get on the team.
Just to say, I think, I know you're saying from their perspective it's a slam dunk. I mean, I think all I would describe it as is an argument, as opposed to many that
totally.
That
and
don't even, it's got the characteristics of a plausible argument.
Of course, and the only reason I'm even making the comment in that over this, so I'm protracting it to this degree, is that there's nothing more dangerous in this day and age than the thing that seems like a slam dunk. Because people, that's what they're looking for, and especially in the polarization factor and everything else. And this was one that really jumped out at me, because I looked at it and thought, that's a silver bullet. That's a solid argument. And it took very little of just sitting and pondering on it for a little while, and then speaking to a couple of people, and then triggering me and me going in different directions to realise, no, it's not a slam dunk argument at all, but it's as usual. Just like with the mask thing, just like in trying to have a conversation with someone who's capable of sitting in the supermarket with you and just saying, why not just put it on? Like, it can't hurt anyone, and even if it's 0.00001 chance of you're saving stopping an infection spreading, then just do it. If you're not doing it, you're inherently a dick. Like, whereas they can say that very quickly, whereas you can't. It's very hard to say, sorry, I'm engaging in a performative rictual that over a long enough space of time is going to have more negative effects, including death, to our culture and our society than than the problem that you're quite rightly concerned about yourself. You can't do that. You can't say that to...
It's quite well put, that must say that.
Well, you can't say it to Mavis at the checkout anyway, and I wouldn't even put it like that probably, like, right? So, in the same way, you've got this issue that you can't, for you to extrapolate it, for you to communicate it properly. It's even longer than that. Like, there's actually data. I don't know what the snapshot would be, but we sort of battered it around before. So you've got a few issues. So we'll start in with where's the ICU response? Where's the response that we've had 2 years to prepare for to make sure we could deal with this situation? Where are all these COVID hospitals that were being built so that we wouldn't have to deal with this problem, so that we wouldn't have to compromise one of the most inherently important human rights, for the sake of some beds? That would be the first thing. I invite you to expand on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a formulation that captures probably several things is that what this implies is a transition from a right to health care, to an obligation to be healthy. Now, if people want to live in a world in which it's an obligation through the threat of imprisonment to be healthy, now let's put aside different interpretations of what is and what isn't healthy, and that comes down to, like, in the extreme sense, is it right to, to take the most extreme version, vaccinate over 5-year-olds when they've got zero chance pretty much of COVID, and yet there's plenty of data on, relatively rare but serious side effects, and that seem to be seemingly sort of disproportionately affecting the young as well. So put aside, who gets to decide what the chosen sort of standards of health are. But do we want to move into a society where it's not only we don't only have a right for healthcare, but we have an obligation, and not only an obligation, but a legal obligation to be healthy, because
to be healthy for other people, because it's connected to other people's health.
Yeah, but to be clear, like, so the argument would be stronger, although I would still vehemently sort of disagree with it, if they were saying that as a result of not being vaccinated, you are spreading COVID. People are therefore getting infected, and therefore, arguably there's some sort of culpability there in terms of causing that. If the vaccine wasn't, in other words, wasn't leaky, which is, I think, a technical term, but it is actually, but it sort of explains what it is, then that would be a slightly more plausible argument. But so just to be clear, what the specific argument is, that you may be more unwell and therefore need to draw on the services of a collective healthcare provision that then could mean that some of those services are less available to others. Well, that applies to everything, right? If you're gonna eat unhealthy food, you're gonna have more. You're gonna end up drawing, statistically speaking, on average, more on a health service at various different stages.
The effect right now of obesity overall. Yeah. If obesity never existed and then tomorrow morning it just started.
Well, COVID had barely exist. That's the other truth of the matter, because diabetes is the major. Is one of the major vulnerabilities. Right.
If it just occurred, I would just quickly to make this just to support what you're saying. if obesity had never been a thing, and then it appeared tomorrow morning, it'd cause a national health crisis far beyond COVID. Like that, we weren't ready for it. All those people were instantly turning up with all those needs unmet.
Yeah. Heart disease, which is the biggest killer, which is predominantly a result of lifestyle choices, and you can go all the way through. I mean, most health issues are the result of lifestyle choices. Other health issues are actually a result of social costs of business enterprise.
Unpack that.
Well, I'm quoting the title of a book actually of a guy who I think
down below.
Yeah, but the fact that the effluents in the the toxins in the air, the effluents in the environment, in the water, etc., etc. A lot of chronic illness is caused by.
Diesel's supposed to be
right.
crazy.
So let's start. So then let's start. Just banning all of that as well. So. And anyone who does that is therefore causing a draw on the.
Let's steel man this though. Okay, so what's the argument? What would be the argument to that? What you're saying seems compelling to me. I hadn't thought it through and I hadn't considered that before. So someone bringing that argument to you, what would be a credible argument against it? If you're saying lifestyle choices, we should to be consistent, we should be pulling. We should be coming down on lifestyle choices in the same way for the cause they have. Is there a thing?
I'm not sure.
Is there an immediacy factor, or is there anything else I'm overlooking? Just before we move on, just so it's not.
I mean, I'm not sure there is. I mean, first because I'm talking about a point of principle, and that's why that phrase I think is important to sort of state at the outset. That is shifting from a right to health, from a right to healthcare and health treatment to an obligation to be healthy. I mean, that is what it's saying. It's saying. It's saying this choice of yours is only actually going to impact you directly, according to the, to the claims and the evidence we're being presented with. In that, if you get COVID, you would be more likely to need to draw on the health service, and therefore, in order to prevent you from drawing on the health service, your freedom of choice and your bodily autonomy and the manifestation of your self-belief and so on can be violated. In fact, let me just put this in a more strong point of the way, because I think it's even stronger than that, because to prevent the the obesity epidemic, all you would actually have to do is increase regulations and ban certain things. That's actually just like preventing people from doing
Still
something.
not ideal.
It's not, but it's much more common, and we do it across. We do it across the board.
Yeah.
It's shaping
it's
shaping the environment in a way in which it's much more difficult, or in some cases even impossible, to make particular choices. It's arguably restricting. Well, it is restricting the the number of choices, or the kind of scope of choices. It's not actually doing what injecting someone against their will is doing, which is which is imposing something directly on
it's a different order,
them.
An order of magnitude higher.
I think it's categorically different, isn't it? It's kind of like the argument Peterson made about the difference between compelling speech versus sort of outlawing sort of forms of it. It's the same. True, yeah. It's the same sort of distinction.
Is their response? Their response to Steelman, the only one that comes to me, is the issues you're talking about are things that it'd be great to discuss policy on those things, but this is a crisis that's occurring right now. It's in the moment. The moral obligation that's on, to play devil's advocate, the moral obligation that's on the unvaccinated to fall in and just cross this Rubicon, like under these circumstances, is that this is happening. We have institutions and facilities that contend with obesity because we do it on a daily basis, and that's expected. This is happening now in crisis mode, which I suppose one small counter to that is we've had 2 years, we could have been ready for it, but then they could say, okay, they should have done. We should have been ready for it, but we're not, and so day zero here. This is the best response. So what's the response to that response? Someone saying.
I mean, first of all, I guess and I'm assuming a lot here. I'm really, sort of taking, if you like, the position of, that I don't actually agree with on factual grounds and many others. But let's just park
which you got to be careful with. But I get what you're saying.
But let's just park that.
Yeah.
I think that one response would be to say, that's all well and good, but you will be crossing that Rubicon in terms of that principle, because you can say that that's a crisis, but it's a sort of, I'm not even sure it's a kind of substantive distinction in a sense, because I could be saying that, all right, well, it's a crisis that I'm not living, that my life expectancy is only 84 instead of 94, right? So if you do something now to stop all these people that are making unhealthy life choices from drawing on that resource, that resource can be immediately now put to other use that will be pure, that will be much more focused on all the things that are going to mean that I live from being, instead of expected life of 84 to being 94. So the emergency point is, because you could say, but every year, every week, you're spending these resources on these people that are making unhealthy lives. Is one more death that's happening 10 years before it could have done if we were spending these resources on an otherwise healthy population, or a healthier population. And the logic just doesn't end. And not only that, the means for measuring these things doesn't, is constantly getting more and more sophisticated. And this is a concern in the areas of insurance and so on. The logic.
The means for measuring the effects of obesity and
the means for measuring
choices.
Lifestyle choices and statistically spitting out implications of that, and combining that with an understanding of someone's genetic predisposition, and embedding technologies that can monitor shifts in those things and what choice you mean. I know we're kind of spinning this out, but the problem is this is a significant step in that direction of having an increasingly biomedical security complex, and this is the point. It's Agamben who says
it's worth going into for
this shift from the right to health to the obligation to be healthy.
Define biosecurity just for some detail here.
Well, very, very, I guess, in a very sort of high level sense, it's the fact that biological systems become a security concern, or increasingly get treated through a lens of security in a way that in a way that previously they haven't done. They've been interpreted as a kind of fact of life. They've been and I think, and so one of the things that enables them to be treated in such a way is the ability to kind of monitor them and set norms and set standards and individualize that monitoring within a population, and therefore if then you're saying that strain on the NHS, for example, is a national security risk, because it's they sort of are saying these things now, because, and I can't remember which institution they changed the name of, but it shifted from something that seemed to be about health to something that seemed to be about security. So it becomes it becomes a risk factor in the same way as the person who's potentially the spreader of contagion is indistinct from the terrorist. That's both threaten life, both threaten the stability of the social order, both threaten the the status quo running of the economy, which of course is a security. Is a national security concern. If the economy is seriously disrupted, that's a serious vulnerability. So it all becomes a kind of securitized space.
So if they responded and said, "Yeah, you're absolutely right. All these fatties having triple heart bypasses and then going straight back to McDonald's, they're next. But this is a crisis right now. We're tending to this now, and then you're absolutely right. Thanks for bringing that to us attention. We're going to deal with all that shit as well." you know, like.
Well, I mean, I think in the court of public opinion, it would start to. I mean, I think
Yes,
if
there's a
people
pragmatics of
realise
it.
that, I mean, yeah, I mean that's what I'm saying in a way. I mean, for you, well,
Yeah,
look,
you can't be
if we're
for
not
this
gonna,
if you're not for this.
Yeah,
Therefore, public opinion is actually in favour with us.
yeah, if we're not gonna, I mean, the next step I think would be then if we, you know, if you wanted to challenge or to at least, I mean, explore, is it even medically justified in that way, and different lines of argument. One would include, well, we don't know at this stage the long-term outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
We also usually measure life in terms of life years, and so given we don't know the long-term outcomes, and we're saying we want to make this mandatory for, you know, potentially 5-year-olds, certainly whatever it is at the moment, over 16-year-olds, I don't even know if it's over 11-year-olds.
Yeah.
What is, you know, if you were, I know you can't do these calculations accurately because there's so much uncertainty and unknowns, but you can at least start to kind of probably construct like risk.
A shit model.
Yeah, risk models of like, oh, well, if we assume this and there are these various unknowns, so you can very easily, I imagine, start to construct something that says, well, you know, if based on our current evidence, you know, in terms of the impact of, you know, increased, you know, hospitalisation and drawing on the NHS, you know, this would have this negative effect, given all these unknowns and the potential that that's mainly affecting older people in general, not only by any means. I mean, there's obviously young people dying of heart disease, young people dying of cancer, but obviously with all diseases, it's predominantly loaded into the higher age brackets. Mm-hmm. So then you've got, okay, well, how do, you know, we would need to start measuring that against, you know, life years lost, and then there's another sort of metric which is quality life years lost, which, you know, so, you know, so that I think you would have to go in, if people said, all right, yeah, like you said, right, fine, yeah, you know, they're next, and yeah, I'm gung ho about that whole, you know, biomedical sort of biosecurity control, then that would be a different line of argument. But like I said, I think if most people thought about it in that way, I don't think if people wanted to be logically consistent and you know, recognise the principle of the matter,
no one's
I don't think there would be a overall public support for that.
No.
There's only public support, I think, because there's a huge degree of misunderstanding and simplification of the pros and cons, and, you know, the majority of people have been vaccinated, and therefore for them it's a zero cost. It's like, and, you know, well, yeah, sort of in a way, sod these other people and what they want, you know, I believe this and I've done it, so you do it. But if it was turned around and said, okay, well, you're not going to be drinking or smoking anymore, or if you are, it's going to be, you know, you know, your detriment to access to healthcare.
Which there's an argument for.
Well, there's
a rational argument for people for there to be a relative degree of healthcare offered, points in a system or something, depending on how much you're responsible for the shit that's wrong with you.
Well,
but
there is an argument, but it's a very, you know, to use an overused term, neoliberal argument. It's a very sort of individualised, and it's not what the NHS is supposed to be. It's not based on solidarity, right? You know, the NHS is like saying, look, you're a fellow human being, and your path in life will be very different, and you will suffer chance and luck and misfortune and all these things. And what we're saying as a community is, irrespective of that, you get what everyone else gets
as well, but mainly as well because what really resonates with me is while there's a hyper rationalist in me that'd say, yeah, if I drink a lot of booze and then I'm in hospital, a 7-year-old kid shouldn't lose a bed because I'm in hospital with liver disease.
And
right?
They probably wouldn't. You know, they do make these decisions.
But these things,
they do take these judgments based not on alcohol use, but on. It
definitely occurs where you know you're draining the system, right? There's that rationalist in me that says, like, absolutely, that makes perfect sense. And then instantly the other voice comes in and says, yeah, but the reason people drink and make silly lifestyle choices is because there's a lot of reasons, but one reason is because they're medicating you know, psychological malaise and a damaged psyche from the kind of crazy culture we've got and the trauma and all that. You can't say why someone is being that person or has that bad lifestyle choice, because the reason they've got it could be in the same way that you shouldn't probably judge a homeless person because, you know, you could easily be in their situation for one, or just for just being born in a different situation, right? So you should recognize that as being. Yeah, I mean, many wouldn't. I'm probably in a minority on this one, but I don't look at a homeless person and say, sort your life out, mate. I look at a homeless person and say, that would be me. 100%, not 99, 100% if I were born in that family. I'm a little bit, I do lean a little bit in that argument of determinism kind of thing. You know, like I admit I've got a bias in that way, but I believe that. And in the same way in the hospital, if someone's having their triple heart bypass, I don't know what trauma it took for that person to have to medicate themselves with food to the degree that they did. Like, there's no way to know. So, and I admit that's a personal position on it, but it's not particularly, it's just subjective.
But the argument I do agree with that. But the sort of argument that I would sort of reach towards first is that the function of that is actually to inculcate a society in which people are free to choose, and in which there is tolerance of beliefs and opinions which are in conflict with each other. Is how do we live with difference? And in a way, if you start sort of how do we live with difference, and how do we avoid social conflict as well? Because it's that space, or that kind of general framework, to take the example of the health service, that allows people to have those differences, and allows us to tolerate those differences. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
and the learning and growth that comes from that tolerance, and
it's kind of, it's kind of funny, but it respects the fact, and we were talking about this earlier, and this is kind of where I'm coming down more and more, because I can, viscerally feel, and not just in the context of COVID, but in other contexts, how much I sort of cherish and put weight on in my individual conviction and my sovereignty over my own will. But at the same time, because I would be a fool not to, I have to admit that I might be wrong on any and all of those counts. So you cannot at the same time say, people are sovereign and so on, so long as they take the current view, or the current consensus, or the current objective view, even if it is objectively true.
It has to be foundational.
Because it has to be foundational, because otherwise you cannot respect. So it has to be, it has to be a situation in which people are allowed to think, and either side could be wrong, right? That person is completely wrong, and the fact that they're wrong is a net bad for society, or within one framework, but actually the bigger net good is that they're wrong,
tolerance,
and they're allowed to be wrong, and
similar
yet
to free
society
speech.
goes on. Similar, because like, to be the person in this scenario, and I know it's only fines and then prison, which is different to them sort of pinning you down, but to be the person that is being pinned down against their will, even if you think the knowledge or belief underpinning their will is wrong, and you think 100% wrong, and may well be objectively 100% wrong, that subjective experience is intolerable and is antithetical to a humane society. It is inhumane, even if they're wrong. It is inhumane.
But then, devil's advocate, someone would argue that it's inhumane to let someone die that didn't need to die, rather than you suffer an indignity.
I mean, I just disagree with that.
Yeah, it's me too. And
I think this comes back to a sort of Agamben point, and also the link between Agamben and Thomas Hobbes, who I kind of wrote my undergraduate thesis on, which is that actually, we cannot have, like, I'm going to say it how in one of the ways that Agamben puts it, like, in a society in which there is no future, by which he means all sort of schemes for human betterment have been jettisoned in favour of the maintenance of the status quo. So, you know, you may well be familiar with a very famous book. I say very famous, I mean within academic circles, I guess, but popularised
within all you
by
Francis.
Let's see, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, right? So it was
I've
it was a very popularised book, and basically it was following the fall of the Soviet Union. The basic argument was that, in a sense, we've reached the end of history in terms of battles over ideologies, and now it's a kind of, it's going to be an increasing coalescence around the kind of Western liberal democratic system, free market society with, you know, these moderations. There'll be variation, but, you know, that's it. And that's kind of, you know, as he put it, the sort of end of history in the sense of the kind of project of modernity for, you know, these competing ideologies and so on. And you know, within that context, you know, there's another phrase, I think it's sometimes attributed to Zizek, but it might be someone else, but someone said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And so I think it's a similar kind of thing, and you see that now in a lot of modern cinema and films and so on, like, whereby, you know, those, whether rightly or wrongly, that sort of play up the fact that we, you know, destroying the world in various ways, or like, what's the one where no one can have any children?
Children of Men.
Children of Men, or whatever. You know, there's all these kind of dystopias, and it's easier to see the end of the world than the sort of end of capitalism or the end of a system that is
true.
Yeah. And so within that context, you know, what is it that binds us together? And this comes back to the biopolitics point. It becomes simply the maintenance of life. So the maintenance of life and the reproduction of a consumer society, above and beyond any kind of striving towards the good life and the kind of politics in the sense that Aristotle would have understood politics, or the ancient Greeks would have done. And so in those conditions, the only really thing that binds these, you know, what are broadly kind of isolated individuals within a consumerist society, you know, a society of the spectacle, is the maintenance of that. And that's why security becomes, I think, dominant as well, because everything is about what are all the hazards and threats that are destabilizing the system that we have to kind of respond to in order to kind of maintain the status quo.
Yeah, well, this only very quickly, because I think it's critical. This is to just go back again to what we're saying about subconscious drives. I was thinking, like, feeding your children and looking after your safety, which I suppose is connected. I was thinking that's the foundation. The foundation is fear of death, you know, like, and the fact that we've got a culture that we've got things hard written into cultural assumptions that, you know, two deaths is worse than one death, rather than no, they're all unacceptable, you know, like that. We can get ourselves into situations where we can sacrifice lots of people in a war, on the logic that it's a numbers game. You know, that we talked about this last time. Like, that as soon as it's like a trap. That as soon as you're saying death is the ultimate evil, then you've simplified everything. It's like, oh, well, great, all we have to do now is minimize that.
Yeah, and
it's such a trap, because as soon as all you're doing is minimizing the maximum amount of death possible, there are so many ways that goes wrong, including exactly this.
Yeah, so when that becomes the object of politics, then politics by definition becomes biopolitical. To minimize death and to also,
well, then it's always been
and like to manage life. Well, let's put that aside, otherwise we'll get dragged away. Because the point to make, and I've kind of probably said more than needed to be said in terms of the context around the sort of end of history and so on. But the point being is that it's only our biological life and the maintenance of that to the maximum length and degree that we share as a political community, really. You know, it becomes the kind of dominant value. So, but the interesting link then back to Hobbes, and after all, Hobbes was the political philosopher who most forcefully and famously justified authoritarianism is that
did he justify authoritarianism? Not to derail you. Did he justify authoritarianism, or did he justify this in itself, or the state? Did he recognise that?
He believed there should be, he believed that there should be no resistance to or challenge against authority, unless that authority was literally threatening your individual life. Otherwise, your obligation was to obey it, and it needed to be a singular authority. There could be no competition between those, because otherwise, you would risk essentially civil war. I mean, he was writing in the context of the English Civil War, and he was essentially, siding with the, with the ancient regime, with the sort of, the pre-Civil War status quo, because he believed that civil war was so dangerous, and that but anyway.
Sorry, I was interested.
But the point being that underpinning all of that, and is that he held as, the linchpin, if you like, the cornerstone of his argument was that the ultimate bad, if you like, was the loss of life. And so that was the cornerstone. And I mean, we could, but we're not going to, I don't think, go into the whole set of arguments, although actually they're quite simple when they're boiled away, even though it's a long book. That is a really interesting link where fear of death or death as the ultimate bad is the cornerstone of a society. Then there are strong arguments that that an authoritarian government is the
natural result.
Yeah, it's the natural result, exactly. And that's kind of against, in a way, I think, or that's in sharp contrast, I think, to kind of a sense of politics, which is about finding a common expression of the good life, through political means, which is more kind of, the Aristotelian view of politics and man as a political animal. So I think, so there's something interesting, and, Agamben makes some of these links between a order that becomes, biopolitical in the sense that he means by that, and the and this thing around death and the maintenance of life as a kind of ultimate value, and then the role of kind of, that leading to kind of authoritarian government and responses. And so the point has to be that actually there are, I mean, everyone knows that. Everyone knows in their personal experience, yes, of course, no one's willing their own death. But if you get to your deathbed to a ripe old age, and you view it as a wasted life in whatever way, then actually death wasn't the biggest thing for you to be afraid of. No. Or if you've sacrificed the well-being of your children in order to avert death, or if you've being a traitor towards your friends in order to, in a serious way, in order to avoid death, or if you, and that was never the case, was it, with the Greeks or with the Athenians? No. There was honour, there was virtue, there were things that you would die for.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to say.
And there should be a society that you would die for. There should be certain values that,
Otherwise, what are you? You're reduced from. It's like the ultimate way of reducing someone from a member of the human race with values and that make you worthy of survival, rather than just frantically reacting for survival. In the way that I've known personally people who died in the 70s that were clinging to the edge of the cliff, desperate for life. And then I've known people who died young that were almost weirdly at peace with it, because they just had a wiser temperament. And then you can take that all the way to kids. Anyone who's known anyone that's had kids die, like kids with leukemia and stuff, it's almost perverse how they're the only person chilled out in the whole arrangement, while their parents are losing their minds. So that's not to, there's a lot of reasons why different people at different ages might be reacting in the ways they're reacting, and dealing with stress in the ways they're reacting, dealing with trauma and all the rest of it. But the idea that the assumption that pure longevity is the metric by which everything else should be measured and force should be imposed is just so without ground, and it's just it's insane when you look at exactly when you use the Greeks example, or you could even take it to Jesus. I mean, I don't know, like Vikings and Scandinavian, like where the life is cheap.
Most cultures.
Yeah, but to some. Yeah, but I mean,
most cultures had ultimate values, much many ultimate values.
They were
above death.
Yeah, and it wasn't a matter of dying; it was a matter of how you died. Like they'd have been absolutely mortified by the idea of dying in a way that weren't suitable for them.
Yeah.
But as long as they were dying in the way that was suitable, that was passable. And you can argue that they were fucking deluded then, because they were just some story that got told to them about Valhalla made them be prepared to die in one way and not prepared to die in another, and that's fine. I can have that conversation, but over thousands of years and generation timescales, what's good for the human race? A story that makes everyone cling to life, not to the degree that they're going to force someone to.
Well, it's the absence of a story, isn't it? It's the absence. I mean, I feel like it is a sort of condition of, in a way, kind of nihilistic.
It's apes with zero narrative. It's literally coming back to the most primal. But this is exactly what you were saying before with when we're talking about the subconscious programs and all the rest of it that are operating for the most part in people. What power seems to do, and I don't mean that in a conspiratorial sense. I mean it in the sense that that narrative hegemony is what it's about. There's competing narratives even between individuals and in smaller communities all the way up. What power seems to do, is capitalizes on the frailty in human beings to be ready to jump back into ape brain, to the very simplistic survival sort of state. And even if we're not actually in that survival state, the cupboards are filled and all the cues are there that an ape would be like, we're fine, everything's good. Even so, we can still be triggered back into that state by, like you're saying about peer pressure and stuff like that. We can be triggered back into a survival state by certain cues that are operating sort of outside of us cognitive awareness a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think as well. I mean, I think I'm conscious of the sort of response that I've heard, which is a legitimate one, which is most people are not doing this out of fear for themselves. They are doing it out of a solidaristic commitment to others. I mean, I think
that was just to counter, just to see what your response would be. It's easy to say. It's easy to signal I'm for the old people or I'm for the whatever. Like you can do that, but it's so easy for that to be the thinnest veil of you being terrified about dying yourself and hoping that other people will say the same thing.
These people in the kind of healthy people in the mid-20s or whatever are genuinely feeling fearful for their life? I mean, I think it's...
No, I don't. I think for them, it's cultural weight, isn't it? It's a repeated things. Mantra.
Yeah.
And I will be... I think, especially for young people, the danger is, and I think we can both probably relate to this one, there's nothing more toxic to you. I shouldn't say toxic, but it's been more your interpretation of it. But like, there's nothing more anathema to where your head's at when you're 17 to 23 than for you to be perceived as someone who is conservative, you want it. It's the nature of a youth to be like gambling, taking chances, liberalism in general, like that, which is exactly why that stereotype holds true. Like for you to be the person that's not defending those values or representative and flag waving essentially for saving people, being about other people, like I think it's a difficult. I mean, obviously, people can be just programmed into extremely conservative values, but I think there's actually an inherent mental, psychological desire to, and it gets into the same thing again about the psychological, what's behind that psychological shit that we've. I believe the basis for that is, as far as I understand it, is that there's a sensible reason for a young primate, a young adult primate, to do the exact opposite of what the older primates are doing, to test new areas and avenues for evolution and just finding the other fruit tree that no one found, whatever it is. So and I think that's pretty well understood that that's why people have a direct desire to move away from their parents and what their parents think and older people or whatever. So when you're in that zone, it's very easy for a narrative to have young people trapped in a selfless, almost like a cult of self-sacrifice. Really,
Yeah, but I don't think it's but I don't think it's just young people. I mean,
you mean you're going to challenge something out of that entire pile of shit I just shoveled onto the table?
I think there's a lot in that, but I do think most people, and I don't think I probably don't agree that it's a thin veneer and that actually it's a fear themselves. I think most people are doing it because it has become a civic virtue to do that, and so there's all the other stuff that we talked about before around peer, not looking like you're this or you're that, even if you might have a few niggling doubts, but most people don't even have niggling doubts because they're just consuming the data that's being presented to them reasonably enough, really, in a way. So yeah, I'm not sure their own, and I think that would be, that's got to be acknowledged, because I think that's a response that I've already heard, and I think it's how many people would feel if they were hearing the notion that it's their own sort of fear of death. But what I would sort of double down on is that the original thing around that phrase, moving from the right to health to the obligation to be healthy, is part of the overall cultural malaise of the only thing we've got as a collective project, really, is to elongate our health and kind of manage more effectively our life processes and the tools and techniques of capital in certain respects and the state is to do those things and to create that as the kind of shared basis. So my point being is, even though at the individual level it might not be a sort of fear of death, it is elevating at the collective level the, if not fear of death, then the extension and longevity of life as the ultimate good and the only common bond. So whether it is in the negative sense of the fear of death, or whether it's in the sort of positive sense of that is the common bond that we can sort of collectively get.
It's got to be a direct result of like this.
And sorry, just to kind of nail that thing, so I think we've sort of meandered around a little bit, and just to sort of bring it back to it. When I think that there's something that really needs unpacking, and like I'm not saying I've fully unpacked it, but I think it's a really important line of thought that people need to consider, is that when that becomes the case, there is something extremely oppressive about that, and it's encapsulated in that idea of the obligation to be healthy and the degree of management of people's lives, and this is the kind of techno-biomedical fear that some of this is a harbinger of. Which is, okay, where do you draw the line? Like, is it so? Okay, we're going to monitor your use of particular medicines. You're going to have a passport that documents that. We're going to monitor your consumption of different things. That's going to feed into a database that insurance companies are going to drive.
Because it's got to be, you got to consider that, and maybe this is because we're all just screwed up monkeys, but for a lot of people, a lot of things that give their life meaning, and I don't just necessarily mean bad health choices, whether it's drinking or shitty food or whatever. A lot of the things that give their life meaning had an element of danger. They've
Definitely.
Yeah. And I think as well, don't you think, like, you've got that thing of there being a collective. It's the first time I've heard that. We've talked about him a little. We've talked about him a few times, and the biopolitics thing. But I've never heard or I've never made the connection of that that factor of it being a prevailing myth, like a defining myth, like it's the one thing we've got left, basically, that life and life, clinging to the longevity in life is where it's at. That couldn't be described as anything but a direct reaction, a result of the death of religion. As soon as you remove the role that religion's played, and this, let's chalk this down as the one time I'm ever going to say anything positive about religion in the sense of what we all mean when we say religion, historically. What the role that religion's played in providing a grounding myths, even let's just degrade it all the way down and say it's all horse shit, it was just interesting myths that people define themselves by and align themselves by, and which have evolved on, very they evolved in line not just with what people want to do to each other in terms of power and stuff, but they evolved in terms of philosophical systems all got incorporated into that over generations, and far more than generations, evolutionary timescales almost. When they've always been there, playing that role, which had all the negatives that we all know attached to that in terms of control and everything, when they're gone, what's left other than, especially when the idea of an afterlife or whatever, or anything, not maybe something less trite than that. Whenever you've removed all that, it's not a possibility that all you're left with is life. It's a fact that all you're left with is life.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a spiritual vacuum, and I was kind of, I had I went, let's put it this way, I went to, I think I told you about it at the time, I went to a ceremony.
Okay.
And which was a deeply spiritual and otherworldly sort of experience. And I came out of it when I'd sort of was slightly sort of reoriented into the world as we know it, and I was talking a lot about kind of the lack of spiritual leadership. It became a little kind of a bit of a joke, a bit of a jokey hook, but I genuinely believed it, or genuinely kind of felt that it had sort of meaning around
it's
that.
a sphere we've evolved with.
Yeah, and particularly at this moment, there is an absolute void of spiritual leadership, and it's been pointed out, and especially, and again, Agamben talked about it with the church. I can't remember, because obviously knows his history much better than I do, but it was something like the church hadn't closed its doors since like 1400s. It might not be, but it was something like that, and yet they'd closed the doors because of the sort of the lockdown measures. They'd removed the space for in a time of crisis, or at least when people felt anxious about something, where actually it's exactly those types of institutions that are required to guide, to provide context, to provide to provide some kind of to relativize the situation, to put it in its greater kind of cosmic sense, right? Closed, and then, but there was a case, and it was actually published in The Guardian, where a large number of various different levels, I think within the Church of England, but it might have included the Catholic Church as well, was speaking out against lockdown, and definitely against vaccine passports, and saying they would never close the door to those things. And Agamben pointed out that even the dead.
Was this given specific churches or just leaders within?
It was it wasn't as an institution they took that position, but it was several kind of leaders and at various different levels. And
right there, you've got demonstrated the distinction between church as an institution and church as the individuals in it that are functioning as they should do.
And it's no surprise, picking up on what you're saying, that people, church leaders and others within the church would say that, because precisely they are able to, within their own worldview, which is not necessarily shared, but I think there are alternatives that can also provide a similar degree of perspective around things, was saying this is not the ultimate good. Actually, like, you know, I think we talked about it before, but like, Jesus would never, Jesus went and embraced the leper. Jesus, would never have isolated himself from his neighbour. These are all things that are antithetical to the teachings that are. Yeah, and so I think there's a lack of that. There is a lack of spiritual leadership. There is a lack of an ability to say, we will not jettison our civilizational values on the basis of this, moderate, I'm going to say, choose your word, but sort of moderate pandemic. And that requires spiritual leadership. What we've had instead is a let's just call, a sort of spiritually devoid, and not even like spiritual is a bit of a triggering word, but devoid of spirit. Like, I'm just this media that's just ticking numbers of deaths and infections on a screen, and that's the sermon. That is the sermon to the masses. Like, it's not, that is biopolitics. That is, that is a crystallization and a sort of visualization of. Of exactly kind of, I think, what it's in, like, in a simple sense.
Like a death cult. It's like a church of death at that point. Like, that's what we're fixated on.
And the irony is, I mean, I was walking here today, just in the peace and the dark, on a winter's evening, in the dark, and I walking past the houses and seeing the big flat screen TVs, like with the neon blue glows coming out, and I don't watch TV. I mean, I watch things on YouTube, so I watch things that are on TV.
Well, you're edgy, aren't you, so?
It's obviously getting curated for me. But again, I was just walking along thinking, honestly, right, if that didn't exist, and I know this is not a profound thing to say because many people said it, I would have had no idea that there was a pandemic, because, and maybe fortunately or whatever, but I have no direct connections with anyone that's directly suffered from it. For those that I do know indirectly, they've been very old, so everyone would have just.
Do you know anyone that's died? Have you heard of anyone that's died?
Yeah, I've heard of people that have died.
Not famous people.
No. I've heard of colleagues as one's grandparent and one's father, both of which I think were really quite old, or father-in-law rather.
Right.
That's probably about it. Other than people that are famous that people have told me about, or some,
And I've only had 2 or 3 of those.
But again, they would have been very old, and that would have been interpreted. That would have been not unusual. And now I don't want to.
Or is in the 1918 flu, in it? 1918.
Spanish flu, 18, I think. Yeah.
Half of everyone, a third of everyone you knew would have dropped dead, right?
I mean, I don't know if it was that high as a third, but I mean, it was a lot, and it was young people, and so it was noticeable. My point is, no one would have noticed. Like, I'm not saying don't collect the statistics and so on, but if it wasn't that through that collection of statistics and through that, conveyance of them, let's say, to put it as kindly as possible, through the mass media, no one would know.
No,
it wouldn't even be a fact. I don't think there'd be a signal. I mean, people might be like, seemed a bit of a bad year. And you're like, oh yeah, cause Uncle so and so, and like, there were a couple of deaths.
But I remember years. I do remember years where 2 or 3
and think what's happened to like our values and the system and the fragility of it on the basis of something that.
And everyone I know that's had it, I know. Most people I know have had it, or either had a positive confirmation of it, or are pretty damn sure that they had it, which applies to us. I had some slightly weird heart myocardia shit passed by. Like, I mean, who knows what crazy shit's gonna. Maybe it's a long-term thing, long COVID and all that. But almost everyone I know has had it, or has likely had it, and all cruised through it with a shitload more ease than I went through my first good batch of my first flu when I was about 20. I remember just catching flu, just general flu, and I remember being like having a wake-up call for how much a human body can just become completely incapacitated, just shaking to the point where I couldn't speak, and not being able to get to the toilet, crawling at the toilet. Like, it was nothing like that. It wasn't even close. And I'm sure it might well be for people who are older or more inflammation or whatever. But I know plenty of people with high inflammation, plenty of people that got COVID and were in the kind of bracket where it's like, oh, well, they might have problems. And they just went, yeah, I felt really shit. And some of them did say, made a big deal out of it. They said, no, I was bad, right? But they didn't sound any more dramatic than I sounded when I got a solid dose of flu. Not minimizing it. I'm just saying that doesn't correlate with the societal response, like to what we've actually done to the fucking planet, let alone just like, nationally, what everyone is doing and what we're about to start doing, like what we're talking about with this. We're now talking about
Forcing
it being
people
completely
against the will,
sensible to force vaccinate.
Driving a wedge down society, creating segregation, creating literally second-class citizens. People within the national borders who have depleted rights, including no right to actually leave the country. And
is there anything to that? Like I mentioned it to you when we were talking before. Like, but just dismiss it out of hand if you want. But is there anything, at least even just worthy of consideration, just to go, oh yeah, it's not a million miles away, to what I said when I said about the fact that we're saying to people, you should be forced to have this vaccine, even while we know that some people can be, injured and die from it. That's a possibility, right? So we could murder you. We probably won't, but we could murder you. There's a chance of murdering you against your will, because it's against your will, so it's murder. We could murder you, but you should do it for our interpretation of the collective good, our definition of the collective good, or health, like maybe even just as specific as health. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but just to try and break out the cognitive dissonance and look at something that we can all go, oh, that's disgusting. When you hear about Nazi Germany cleaning out the DNA of whether it's disabled people or gypsies or whatever else, whether in their mind we're gonna cleanse it, leaving aside the scientific issue that there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that you're going to get rid of disabled people by killing disabled people, but from where they're coming from, in terms of let us kill these individuals so that the collective will be better off, whether it's in terms of, because as soon as you're saying the gene, I guess
the obvious difference is that even though as you said, if someone's having it done against their will and they suffered and they died from it, which is, there's been cases, then it would be kind of killing them. They believe that they're on aggregate saving more of those people, don't they? Which is not the case with sort of trying to.
Why wouldn't it? I think Hitler
disabled people
would have been thinking, but
even those individuals themselves, that's a form of just
authoritarian. They've been conditioned to, however individuals have been conditioned to think that, right?
Well, they're saying there is evidence, right? There is, scientific evidence that if you have this vaccine, that will enhance your, that will make you more likely to live overall.
Who is saying that?
The state.
Aren't they only saying that if you have this vaccine, you will have less symptoms? I think that's the only claim being made at this point.
Yeah, less symptoms, meaning less likely to be hospitalised, meaning less likely to die. So they're saying if you get COVID, you will be less likely to die if you have this vaccine.
Yeah.
And I guess they're also saying, like, even though there are very, very, very rare side effects, there's more chance. There's less chance you would die of the vaccine than the chance that you will get COVID and would have otherwise died, but won't now die. So I guess that I think what they will be, what they're saying in a sense is, by having this vaccine, your chances of dying overall.
But they can't say that. It's not tested properly. We don't have the time. Like, what they're saying is there is a threat that we claim is large, while actually not being able to really defend that proposition. But we claim that there's a threat that's large. You should risk death, forcibly risk death, in order to mitigate this threat for the greater good of the
No,
collective.
but the only way you're mitigating it is that you're not going to be one of those people taking up an ICU bed. And so by the very
exactly
facts that you could be one of those people taking up an ICU bed,
Yeah.
they're saying you might end up in a position where you're really, really unwell and potentially will die, in an ICU bed.
So is
that's
the
the big
sales
difference.
pitch concern for you? The sales pitch
Well,
concern
it's
for
not.
I don't think
It's
it is.
not. That isn't the sales pitch,
So
but
the pitch is for the collective. The pitch is that you need to be out of that hospital bed
But the
so
only
that
reason
cancer
the sales,
patients aren't.
but the only reason the sale pitch isn't for you is because if that's all it was, you could say, "Oh well, thanks for your concern."
Right.
But no.
Exactly.
So the
that's what I'm
sales
saying,
pitch is
to
for
do
the
German
collective.
thing.
But yeah, all I'm saying is the reason it's not analogous to the German thing is if we take it all at face value, is that they believe in enforcing you to have that they are reducing overall your chance of dying.
Your chance, personally.
Personally, yeah.
Yeah, but that's not what they're selling. They're selling it on
But they are indirectly, because they're saying otherwise you might end up in an ICU unit and you might end up...
No, I think the weight of the cultural, what I've experienced anyway, the weight of the pressure for someone to get vaccinated is the moral obligation to not...
End up in an ICU unit.
To not prevent someone else from receiving necessary healthcare. You are taking the risk of that, accidental death, that small statistical possibility of a death, in order that the collective have an overall increased level of health, because all those people can get on those cancer wards, all those people can do whatever.
I get that, but the only...
I don't want to be. I'm not being too specific with it. I'm just saying, because I weren't saying it's exactly the same.
I get that's the pitch.
But is there enough correlation to say, yeah, it's kind of weird actually how the central request that's being made to the citizen is the same. I mean, it's not even a request when you're killing disabled people.
It is, for the reason I'm saying, in that it, in the example, that you gave in Nazis, that is like, okay, we're going to sacrifice your life. I know you're saying it's not a direct analogy, but but we are going to kill you if for the better of the collective well-being. And you're saying in this case, there's a slim chance that you could be killed for the benefit of the collective. So at that level, there's no danger. But I think the difference is that on face value...
It's still a murder.
Yeah, but on face value, they believe that it will... you'd be less likely to die. So what they're giving you is something that's going to mean that you're less likely to die than if you didn't have it. I know that's not the appeal they're making,
but the way that it's effective in our culture, the way that it's manifested now, that wouldn't matter, because people would just say, "Oh well, thanks for your opinion, fuck off," like you said.
Yeah,
but the only reason it's got political ramifications,
I do
is
get
because the implication is you will help the greater good if you submit to this, and if you submit to this, there is a chance you will die. So if you submit to this, whilst there's a chance you will die, overall there's a lower chance that you will die than not submitting to it. I mean, that has to be really a really important difference. Repeat that. So they're saying
if you submit to this,
yes,
there's this chance that you will die as a result of this, this very small sort of thing, but overall there's less chance that you will die, because there's a bigger chance that otherwise you would contract COVID, get worse symptoms. Well, this would have to be the question. I mean, I don't know. Are these, can they plausibly say that? Is there more chance that you would die of an adverse reaction than you would die of COVID? I mean, I don't know.
And this is the thing with the ICU'S
and then, like
now,
you say, with the lack of future information on that. I mean, it has to, I mean, I guess there could be evidence that there's more chance you'd die of the vaccine. I'm not saying there is evidence that. I think there could be. I don't think there could be the opposite. That there isn't,
and to be honest, it doesn't matter if it's 100 to 1. The point is, you're being forced. Or we're talking about a world that we're coming into where you might be forced, right? So that's the issue. It's that you're not. It's been taken out of your hands. It's not an informed choice that you're making.
No,
and I'm not.
well,
so
absolutely.
That whole German. The only reason I was even making that, because it just struck me as like it's become comical. It's almost cliche. Like you don't want to compare anything to that's Germany, but it just struck me as funny that it's like it's not unquestionably different, but I don't think it's different enough that you can't look at it and be like, it's still expecting a person to take. Yeah, well, I've said it.
Well, I mean, put it I mean, this definitely needs more sort of detailed unpacking. But, you know, the Germans practiced biopolitics. I think it was a different form of, you know, the Nazis practiced, but it was a different form of that. So, and they used, and public health was a big sort of narrative. So,
well, it's that diseased outsider idea, right?
There is something interesting within that mix to kind of look at in detail.
Well, there's that. It's we've talked about it before. Now I always forget his name. Happiness hypothesis. What is his name?
Yeah, I know you mean.
Put it in anyway.
Yeah.
He's a huge part of his entire. Not in that book, in the other one. A huge part of his entire thesis is the way that the unclean outsider is that's an archetypal sort of emblem of the way our psyches operate, and it makes perfect sense. There would have been nothing more valuable than recognizing you need to keep that guy away from you, he's about to die, like in a primitive sense. And that's been manipulated, and it's a consistent theme through.
Well, I think you've probably seen more of it than I have, but like I've seen some of, well before COVID, like some of Jordan Peterson's lectures, and he talked about how extraordinarily accurate. He said, I think he said something like there is almost no comparison in the social sciences around the strength of the correlation between disease prevalence and authoritarianism. So
as in its emergence, just
as in if you try to track variables to look like nice. When you do the regressions or whatever within the sort of statistical analysis, that is by far the because I did a course on statistics and I did a sort of thing. But it's a long time ago, I forget. But ultimately, what you try to do with to isolate how significant particular variables are, because you can never do actual causation. I mean, to do causation, you need to construct a broader set of a narrative, I guess, around why statistics is only doing correlation, but it helps you to arrive at claims around causation. But point being, so I'm not saying that there's causation, but the stronger you can make the correlation, and that can be done through all sorts of statistical techniques, the more confident you can be that actually this is causative, especially if you can start to discount other correlations. So I mean, I'm sure Jordan Peterson said something to the effect of this is as close as you get to a sort of one-to-one correspondence as you get in the social sciences.
Yeah, I think he did. I don't know if he referenced Jordan Peterson in that book, but I remember him giving marshalling a lot of really persuasive data from history that we're so controlled by that idea of that unclean, and you can see it in especially Nazi Germany, but you can see it in loads of other examples.
And so people sort of called him paranoid and criticised him for it, but it's no surprise that Gambon says something like in his commentary on the pandemic, when he put it better than this, but essentially when the terrorist and the war on terror is waning in terms of its efficacy as the the potential, the enemy within, the terrorist cell, this thing that almost has a kind of viral element to it, radicalization spreading within the minds of
like
people,
the communist thing,
and these things, popping up all over the place, and obviously, and the thing is, everyone accepts, or not everyone, but certainly the left and sort of critical theory and critical thinkers tend to recognise, the fact that at the very least that whole discourse has been used to as a way of increasing control and reducing sort of civil liberties and so on, and persecuting minorities, etc., etc. how powerful compared to that is the potential in terms of monitoring and control and of this kind of ineffable, invisible vector of viral spread. Well, let me just say my bottom line on all of this is like, and I might be wrong, but everything that's happened so far is sort of confirmed or validated sort of the original suspicion. The original suspicion doesn't have to get into sort of motivations or anything. It's just a kind of a predictive model for
where we're going,
of where things are going. And my value system and what I want for my life, my children's life, and the kind of the world that I would like to live in is one that is not dominated by these increasingly intrusive systems of monitoring and control, and that this is giving birth to that. So, to be perfectly honest, and I think it's important to be so, there are few arguments that can be made that would outweigh the fear and concern around that. And I think that guy who we were talking about before, that guy who you were showing me his book,
Paul Kingsnorth,
was making the point that the divide here is not really, or is not necessarily really about different factual claims. Of course, there is factual claims underpinning this, and there is a real issue around the integrity of a lot of these claims, as we've discussed throughout. Mm-hmm. But I think what's sat underneath that is a group of people who are either unaware or indifferent or skeptical of the fact that this is a big sort of leap forward towards
subconsciously compelled to just keeping quiet and having it and going easy with it. Like,
I'm trying to be kind of digital authoritarianism and the link between digital and biometric and biotechnological and all the rest of it, and those of which I'm definitely in the camp which find that a terrifying prospect, because it's a system of control which has hitherto not been in the wildest imaginations of the most creative science fiction writers. And I don't know if that sounds hyperbolic. I think people are not sort of sensitive enough to the trajectory that we're on, and the kind of so ultimately that is sort of my position against most of this. If people can make arguments and say, oh right, well some people are going to die, like I can dispute some of the facts around that. I think the vaccines and the goalposts have changed a lot all the way along. First it was like we just need to vaccinate the vulnerable. Well, first it was we just need to flatten the curve. Then it was we need to wait for the vaccine because it's coming, it's nearly here. Then it came and it was we just need to vaccinate the vulnerable. Then it was we just need to vaccinate the adult population. Then it was we need to vaccinate everyone twice. Then it was we've vaccinated everyone twice, but actually in all the countries that we've done that, like Israel and so on.
I think as well it's a value. When you do it stage by stage like that, you almost undermine the power of the point. What's I think's more persuasive is to go all the way back to where we were when we recorded that first conversation, where we said we'd said for the first time in his entire lives we felt like there was actually direct compulsion. We were being compelled to not talk. If you're a conspiracy, if someone's have you heard anyone discussing conspiracy theories? And it made us say, right, people need to now start just having conversations. Anyone, don't matter who they are, don't matter if they've got any qualifications, just need to be openly discussing in order to further that.
In order to not be captured, for the minds not to be captured, really, in order to actually be having their own conversations and the public to be having conversations like they always have done in pubs and elsewhere. The sense checking, going back to that, Dave or whoever it was, again, his innate wisdom well, and just even if it's innate stupidity, even if it's innate stupidity, it's a counterbalance to many other things anyway. So it's almost a verbal democratic vote for your reality that you're sort of casting, kind of thing.
Shit, I've lost why I derailed you. What were you saying when I pulled you off that?
I think you said something like.
What were you saying?
Well, I was starting to list all the different, first.
That's right. And when you were stretching them out over the last 2 years, you were saying, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. What's more persuasive is to go back to where we were when we did the first episode, and the logic we were in with the first episode, and say, at that time, if you'd said to people, if you'd pulled anyone on the street, or even some of the more alternative and sort of flaky friends I've got, and said, 2 years from now, under 2 years from now, Austria will be confirming mandation, forced vaccinations, effectively forced. Because if you're being fined and going to jail, your entire livelihood is being undermined, and your life's just been derailed. Full stop.
Yeah.
So it's not quite being pinned down and vaccinated, but it's effectively the same, right? You're deleted as a citizen, right? If you'd have said to any of those people, this is going to be happening in 2 years, every single one of them would have called you paranoid. Beyond exception.
They did do.
And they did. Well, this is proven in the fact that I could list 7 or 8 people, and I was in no means by no means was I like forthright with this sort of stuff. It's not. I
this
talk
was the
about
concern.
These were the. I was talking to people. I was talking to people.
I'm worried it might go in this direction.
Yeah, and talking to people who are like, what do you think about this? This is a scary direction, right? These people who are already pretty alternative or whatever. Full-fledged hippies, and other than the flakiest of my mates, it's almost been the year that confirmed some of those. We're talking sort of some derogatory a little bit sometimes about the end of the conspiracy theory spectrum when people are just being daft, but interesting that actually it's sort of confirmed some of the only people who've been uniformly right in the last 2 years have been the people with some the crazier end of the ideas, other than all the way down to people saying what we were saying and being, I didn't get laughed at, but it's just like, no, that's paranoia. There's no way that can happen. Like I even down to the extent of people saying, close friends, and switched on people saying, there's no way they'll get a vaccine. It's impossible to get a vaccine. There's no way they're going to ever try and coerce. They could never get away with that. People will hit the streets. And then the idea of mandation, like they're being mandated and people being forced, zero possibility. You're just being paranoid. That's the powerful way of putting it, where it's like, that's what we were saying then, not to do the profit thing, because all we were doing is regurgitating information from other places. That's what we were saying then, and we were nervous enough. We've known each other for years. There was nothing that ever made us go, oh, let's have a podcast, or let's get together and talk about shit and record it. It was only in that the milieu, those events and that time, that had us thinking, actually, this is worth doing, just for each other's purpose, so we knew we're having a discussion and we're not bothered if people hear it, right? And that's what other people should be doing. For it to over the short period to go from almost everyone would say, you fucking paranoid, don't be ridiculous, to now they don't go, whoa, I would have thought that was paranoid 2 years ago. I need to somehow align these two counter things. They can go from, oh, you're paranoid, to now most of those people would say, yeah, justified. It's like, well, wait a minute. Like, you would have called someone paranoid about it then, over it then, and now it's just something that you can take as read.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of shit that you need to analyse in that to be coherent.
Yeah, and the biggest thing is probably understanding something like a narrative arc or whatever. If you go on a narrative is a journey. It's a symbolic representation of a journey or whatever. But it is literally a journey. You are following a story, so
with
you
an
start
implied
off
destination.
with an implied destination, but also as the person or people engaged in that journey, in that story, you are obviously being moved at a different pace to sort of arrive at a different position. So I mean that in a way that's kind of what explains it, why at the start they could say, oh, that's paranoid or whatever, and by the end saying, yeah, that's justified.
So
yeah,
what are the I think a lot of people, me included, I've got a bit more clarity on it now after talking to a few other people and thinking about it myself, weighing things up a little bit. But I think a lot of people right now, I said it to you before, and I stand by it. Like, I don't think there's maybe never been a more important decision people are going to make in my lifetime, in any I don't know, like, for decades, like, a more important decision than where they stand on the idea of whether people should have their bodily integrity overridden on the basis of everything we've been talking about. It's a massive discussion now, and it's probably only going to be as big as it is for a few months before we end up wherever we end up.
Yeah.
And directions are going to be taken, and possibly like social consequences are going to be irreversible on the basis of this. And at the moment, it's compelling, in the wrong direction. I was pretty compelled by that, that silver bullet argument that the ICU'S are full. You're doing, the unvaccinated are demonstrably killing people. It's very easy to try and make that sort of, it's hyperbole, but it's for someone to just hear that snapshot or see that tweet, it's very easy to just walk away and say, yeah, this is it. My mind is made up on that, and unless you're going to really put a lot of time into it, it's going to take some unpacking to get you to unmake your mind up on that. On that basis, what's the counter to it? What are the counters to it? Like, in brief, like we've said a few, but then, there's the lack of any real honest and open conversation about ivermectin and what they call monoclonal antibodies. That's been the big thing. I mean, there's a lot of bullshit.
I couldn't have said that, but yeah, that is what. Yeah, that is what it is. Yeah,
I only remember clone because my brain was going, so is it cloned? Where does it come from? What do they do? I know nothing about it.
I think
all
that
I know
sounds
is
right, yeah.
All I know is there's a lot of other
it's
things.
It's not just ivermectin as well. It's others, and ivermectin's a trigger, isn't it? Because there's all that. Did you see the Rogan controversy?
I saw him to his credit. I
nailed him.
I saw him.
CNN.
Just
kept referring to it as horse
and he's like,
medicine.
stop what you're doing.
Yeah. This was prescribed by a doctor. Yeah, right. And
well, it's just so ridiculous.
Did you see that he had the medical correspondent or whatever on the thing? And he had to admit he
shit it, and it's just And to his credit, Rogan's like, he could have just pinned him and went, no, stop. You're not, and he made it. Yeah, he really went after him with the central point that this is a medicine that was being represented in the media as a horse dewormer, right?
Yeah.
That has, one of the most prestigious histories as a human medicine that exists. The only problem it's got is that it's out of patent, you know what I mean? And it's like, there's not a lot of money to be made.
And they're saying there's not sufficient evidence for it, for its effectiveness. But then again,
there's shitloads of evidence.
But there is a lot of evidence. Some of it's like, because I know that, there's less evidence than originally people like Weinstein was saying, because a couple of them, big ones, got legitimately questioned and there was issues.
Okay.
So I've kind of followed it, but I still think it's still got a lot in favour of it. And there's other things
that where
as well.
It's being used, it's having insanely huge effects.
I think it's exactly. I still think there's a lot of
success rates
evidence
that vaccines
where
could propose.
I think there's a lot of evidential.
Was that was that a bullshit? I just said far beyond the success of what vaccines are achieving in the way that they're achieving and with the downsides that are required. Whereas this is just a completely safe medicine that's been used for decades.
Well, certainly, I mean,
I'm right in that there's no
known negative health effects,
So then just
exactly. So
how much have we got?
So we don't even need to compare it to vaccines. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like, it's much cheaper. It's available to the world. And if there's people who don't want to get vaccinated, they could take it as well. So, and if it's got zero effect, it's got zero harm. So Let's
at least do the experiment and see if these people don't start clogging up the ICUs. But anyway, so that's one thing, like an open and honest conversation. Because let's say ivermectin turned out to be bullshit. There hasn't been an open conversation about it. I've looked diligently, right?
Yeah.
There hasn't been an open and sensible debate about that subject, right? It's all been polarized, and I don't know as much about the monoclonal antibodies, but from what I've seen and the sources, it sounds like that's something that I'd be fairly prepared to say. That it seems like this is something that's worth attention as well. Other than that, I'm not. But
just before we do the
Yeah.
bullet points, can I do one more kind of sort of philosophical bit, which is like one.
I knew we shouldn't have sent you to university.
One conscious.
You were normal. When we sent you to university.
One thing I'm conscious of is like, when you're saying like the biggest decision that people have to make as to whether they're going to come down on this side or the other.
Oh yeah, you questioned that earlier, so yeah, let's know what you think.
I do agree in many respects. I just think that we also have to recognise that one of the commonalities and the reason Agamben was commenting on this is what he talks about in terms of the sovereign ban, and he actually thinks that the ability of the
what's the sovereign ban?
Well, the ability of the sovereign to ban particular to
sovereign
create
defined as
the state,
the holder of power.
Yeah, the holder of power. That actually what is foundational to their power is the ability to create the homo sacra, the bare life, the one that is excluded from the body of citizens. And the recent examples of that are refugees that are...
It's back to that dirty factor again, isn't it?
Yeah, to an extent. And then also
partially.
the sort of Guantanamo Bay stuff and the war on terror stuff where, they weren't even classed as,
we can do this
They
because...
classed them as enemy combatants. They created this whole, like, extra legal thing so that they could do it.
Yeah.
So, I think, what is, there are clearly... I mean, I don't know what the right word is. It's not an analogy. I mean, there are clearly... that is happening, or in what we're seeing towards people who are not vaccinated. They are being
undoubtedly.
Yeah, they're and that's what is meant in a way by sort of second-class citizens. There are certain rights removed and whatever. So all I wanted to say is that in a way this is that situation coming home to roost on, in some cases, sort of middle class and sort of thing is, and I just think that needs recognising, because in that sense it's not unprecedented, and it's important to say that for two reasons. One is that it's why that kind of Agamben lens is really useful in sort of looking at that, because it provides a sort of a way of looking at it. I'll just leave it at that for now. But secondly, it also shows that the solidarity is kind of, I wouldn't say it's no good sort of us sort of talking about how important this is, because it's potentially affecting us, but it's the same thing that is happening, people who are experiencing that in other spheres, whether it be kind of refugees or others, and in fact I think, I don't want to make comparisons, because there are all sorts of, I don't want to make a comparison between, the unvaccinated, because it's just an icky thing to do. On the one hand, forcing someone to be vaccinated seems, that bodily integrity thing seems in some ways even worse. But on the other hand, clearly, like, the plight of a refugee is just not comparable to someone in a. So I'm not making comparisons on that level, but
I'm saying just to put another angle on that, I don't think you can make a comparison to that, but I think it's because there isn't, either one isn't inferior, it isn't worse than the other. Like it depends completely on the individual.
Well, I know I would rather be.
You'd rather be forced vaccinated.
No, I wouldn't be rather, but no one is being forced vaccinated. I'd rather be subject to fines.
People might be forced.
No, I would rather be subject to fines and
jail rather than be a refugee.
In many cases. I mean,
universally.
Probably, because the definition of a refugee is that they are significantly under threat if they kind of return to the.
All right. So what's the difference between a refugee? We're doing that digression thing. But what's the difference between a refugee And to make my point, like, because you're forced now to kind of make it this way. A refugee in the gentlest sense, someone who would be defined as a refugee, right? No, seriously, someone coming from somewhere that's...
All right, yeah.
You know
obviously,
what I mean?
there are border cases.
Yeah, so someone who's on the border case there,
yeah.
And then me as...
we are comparing now, aren't we? I just said I didn't want to compare.
I think it's worthy. And then me as an unvaccinated person who, in recognising that I'm going to be fined and jailed and lose my livelihood, and being fined and jailed, and perhaps my partner being fined and jailed as well, and then my children going into care and being vaccinated, right? No, what am I saying anything? What?
All right, so yeah, you both go to prison, and then
if me and my partner are in prison, then the kids are in children's homes and get vaccinated, right? So what I do instead, obviously, what? No, that's legit, right?
Yeah, it is,
right.
Yeah.
So in that situation, I don't.
I'm laughing at how surreal it is, but yeah,
right. Yeah. So I don't go to jail. What I do is I get the fuck out of here, right? If I know me and my partner are going to go to jail and my kids are going to go into care, I leave. By whatever means I can, I escape the clutches of this shit system that's around me, right? How am I not a refugee? And how am I not a more extreme case of a refugee? Yeah. Well, but then I am inherently. But then I am already. If you know that power exists, once it's mandated and in place.
Well, this is the again.
And you can go to jail.
Then. Yeah, this is the again point.
Right, so
we're all under threat of the sovereign ban.
Right,
yeah.
so to not go too far from it, that's my reason for arguing. It's far too messy to ever take one refugee and compare them to another refugee, or take one refugee and compare them to anyone who's having their bodily sovereignty overridden because on the basis of jail and violence, because they're in the same fucking situation straight away. So I'd argue that, but what I was gonna say.
So I think that was a helpful digression because
I think what it enlightens is how close we are now in this state of affairs to come back to exactly what you were saying, to being shoulder to shoulder with the people who've been bearing the fucking cross of the global state violence, right? Now to just challenge or to tweak that thing. Well, not even to challenge it. What you were saying about the middle class are now being brought into this game. I don't know if I said it to you. I don't know if this is something we talked about, but this was my go-to statement when the whole COVID crisis kicked off and people were getting animated. People who were in there. There was people ignoring it and thinking it's no big, and not choosing to look at the issues regarding authoritarianism that were relevant, and then there was the people that were saying, holy shit, look how bad this is, look at what's going to happen, look at the effects, sensibly. Just playing devil's advocate, I suppose, my counter, I agreed with them, obviously, but my counter was, I'm not quite as worried. I'm worried about the results in the same way I am now, in the same way we've been proven to have been right to be worried about it, but there were a lot of people at the time talking about how this was like completely unique. This was like this complete, nothing like this had ever occurred. And I kept making this point over and over again that what's happening here is the same shit that other people have been dealing with in different classes and levels of society. Now it's become a middle class problem. Now it's uniform across culture. Like everyone is going to be on the receiving end of this shit. And yeah, I mentioned it because as soon as you said that, then I'm like, I haven't heard anyone else say that, and it's exactly what I was saying before. Go on.
Well, I think we have to deal with it's that turn of phrase. It's a middle class problem. It reminded me of it's a first world problem because I think that's how many people will see it. And I think there's some legitimacy in that. But you know what I mean?
Switch middle class out.
Do you know what point I'm making?
Yeah.
In other words, people will look at that and they'll say, are you guys kidding me, right? These people who are refugees are literally for doing, for probably, potentially being the wrong ethnicity in a particular area. There's people going to turn up at their door and potentially murder them, or I know that's probably the
If
some
my
of the most
children are
extreme.
going to go into care,
but only
and get forced
but
vaccinated
only
against their
because
will.
only because you're not willing to take
Be
a vaccine
forced
which is proved to be efficacious and safe. Do you know what I mean?
instantly, like that's the thing. Like,
But do you know what I mean? That's what I'm saying. That it kind of.
But the argument,
I found it funny that it's like middle. It's become a middle class problem,
Well,
but in the
that's it.
sense that it's also
Switch the
I think
middle
would be
class out.
seen by no, but it doesn't matter what we say. I think it's just funny because most people would say, "Oh my God, that is a sort
they
of
would,
first world problem,
they would,
isn't it?" Or,
but my point stands that this is it's a situation where those issues that are huge, are critical, are now starting to affect people. And it much better than middle class, because I didn't use middle class when I was talking about this actually in the early days. What I used was, I can't even remember I don't remember give it a phrase, but it was along the lines of the Guardian writers and the people connected to them. What's happening now is the people who have an actual voice in the culture are now being able to proclaim how their lives are going to be affected and recognize what's going on, and they've got the benefits of a Western education, for whatever that's fucking worth, for them to identify the historical patterns, and they can see trajectories, right? So, but I think first of all, I think a huge waste at this point would be people getting bogged down in distinctions between middle class and the sort of plight of refugees as it's existed. In this particular instance, this shit there's no boundaries. Like, this shit is a threat to the sovereign individual, and that if maybe the one positive in this is that everyone is about to be potentially legitimately in the same boat.
why everyone, even the vaccinated?
Well, no, I'm saying, because you've got a choice to. If you want to be vaccinated, then fair enough. You've conceded, you've complied, right? You're out now. You've done that. And then of the remainder, it doesn't matter what class or race you're from. You're facing the same problem. And I'd argue that the problem you're facing is every bit as big, including
Every bit as big as a refugee in a different country.
Yeah, and I use the example of saying someone
As
who's
an
got
ethnic minority, that the police might knock the door down and sort of shoot dead. I'm taking the extreme.
Yeah, absolutely, as you should. I stand by the idea that if I was given a choice between being here's why I'd say it. It's not that it's a choice. Here's why I said there's no difference. Because if I was in pick your country, in pick your situation, and I thought that my children were in real visceral danger, genuine danger, I'd run. Here, if I thought I was going to be imprisoned, and my wife was going to be in prison, and as a result my kids were going to be in real danger, which I believe the vaccine, if not does imply, it at least the strong
possibility
possibility
have the
of
vaccine,
it does.
though, Dan?
I thought I would. A year ago I thought I would have done, and now I wouldn't, because there's other more complicated, just the element of coercion to the degree it's at.
Well, I think
there's a
that's
lot
it,
of
isn't
other
it?
things.
It's not actually.
But I don't want to just go away from the tangible threat as well. Like if you think about me, as soon as I get engaged in this conversation, if that was to happen, me keeping quiet and just having the vaccine, my kids are fine. I instantly know I've safeguarded my kids. So anything beyond that, whether it's taking a stand at my place of business or it's taking a stand in what I do in terms of me just having a vaccine, instantly endangers my kids. But surely inherent to that is the biggest thing of all. Like I'm compliant. I'm just going along at that point. What is anything worth at that point?
Yeah.
And I think for your kids, for you to put yourself in a situation as well where you're taken out of the sphere of that control, where you can look after them in this fucking scenario, in this state of affairs where we are now.
Yeah.
I get it. I get that other people have got horrendous atrocities being committed against them, but ultimately, the capacity to run, if it's a possibility for you, I'd say there is a station above. There is a refugee and a disenfranchised class. There's a station among them which is bigger than everyone else, and it's the people who want to run and can't. right? And I agree with that. And arguably, I've got a better chance of running here than someone does in a lot of situations in a traditional, what we think of as a most typically occur in refugee circumstances. But provided they can run and there's a capacity for them to be outside of the sphere of influence that is dominating them, of which I fucking no chance see. I can't even leave the country. Right,
yeah,
so
but I want to push this because
you should,
because it's kind of serious and it's quite sort of triggering and I'm worried about a sort of false comparison because surely a factor has to be what is the level of risk of complying, right? So
total sovereignty. Personal sovereignty.
Okay, yeah.
Bigger than everything.
Yeah. But
if you say but, you're undermining everything you've said up to this point.
I know, but there are always degrees of that. I mean, what is for example, it comes down to how you're going to define sovereignty in a way, because you get this argument in predominantly sort of, I guess, the more right-wing press about many of these people aren't refugees, they're actually sort of economic migrants, and there's I'm not an expert in the area. I don't know where the line is drawn. The consequences facing the individual in the situation, justifies them being classed as a refugee versus not. Surely, well, but there'll be some set of criteria.
Who draws the line?
So yeah, I don't know. Human rights lawyers that then get established in things, right?
Why do they draw it?
Well, let me just. But the point being is that because whoever draws it and wherever it's drawn, there is a line.
Why? If there's a line, why is it not? It's got to be value-based. It can't be on the conditions of the person's existence. It has to be your sovereignty was compromised, or your bodily sovereignty was compromised, or you were murdered, or something like that.
What's like, I don't know, let's just say working in a... I'm just picking this example as a starter. Having to work in a sweatshop for sort of, I don't know, 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, and no alternative to that, and your children even within that sort of still being just about being fed but being malnutrition, lacking in key essential sort of vitamins and nutrients, and you sort of flee to another country. I mean, is there sovereignty being impinged in that situation?
Because it's...
Well, well, let's notch it up a step. You can start to do that, and you can see why. But
that's what I'm saying. I'm not degrading their experience. I'm not saying their experience counts less. I'm just saying everyone's counts equal, and you can't. My point is, people will be willing to run, as you say.
Yeah. For various different levels, facing various different levels of risk, and some people would look at that and say, well, what? You had to work let's say, 12-hour day, 6 days a week, and you were only just scraping by, and you were losing all sorts of material freedoms because of that, and your children weren't getting a proper upbringing because of that, because you were never there to care for them, and it was causing trauma.
Compare that, just to stick to your point.
I guess all the point
compare
is that. So, right, run to somewhere where your sovereignty can be more
before
expressed,
you go on to that, stick to, just from what you were saying there, compare to... I hesitate to use my own man as an example because he definitely didn't have the worst existence, but an entire class and generation of people and then you go every generation you go back for the last 4 or 5 generations, it gets a shitload worse. But even to use my dad as the mildest one, who's just one generation beyond me, worked his fucking ass off all his life, working with shitty chemicals, and died far earlier than he should have done because he was working with shit he shouldn't have been working with, and he was working actually completely content in his work to a degree, in that's what he was culturally identified with. It's like, I am a worker, that's what I do. The kind of that work ethic, right? So without even unpacking the whole extra dimension of what happens when a person's so enslaved that they love their servitude, they love the work to that degree. Let's not even go there. which you can't, and this is what's so important. I mean, to keep it as simple as possible, you can't look at an individual and compare, especially from an outside perspective. Maybe someone could that's close to him, but from an outside perspective, you can't say this experience is different. As much as it's much easier for me to build a case for why the hypothetical person you laid out, suffers a lot worse than the worst suffering you could ever have in this country. Yeah, I'd rather fight that case in court than the other one, right? But it's an opinion. It's subjective. I don't know what the faculties are, the cultural or religious faculties of that person are that give them a sense of meaning in driving against that oppression, where the oppression itself could end up being the thing that they define themselves by and therefore feel powerful, versus someone in the other more privileged environment actually having a much worse experience because they're completely spiritually devoid from any spiritually, again, in that loose term. So all I'm saying, I'm not even saying you can do this. All I'm saying is, it's the simplest thing I'm saying. I would be terrified of assigning a degree of difficulty or loss or whatever else.
I think probably the answer,
other than saying only just to finish, sorry, I would be terrified of assigning that. So then for clarity and the capacity to even make distinctions and move forward, I choose to say, okay, well, we've got to assign something. Well, and I'm not even saying that it has to be sovereignty. I'm not even saying that. I'm saying it just has to be something value-based. It has to be something that can be broadly applied and that can stand outside that person's own culturally endowed faculties for dealing with reality.
I think what that has to be is freedom of belief, which is a standard. If people are being persecuted for their religious beliefs, that is a legitimate, I think, refugee case, for example. So I think
that's
beliefs.
Valid. So if someone
comes back to my point right at the beginning, and I don't know if we were kind of recording at that point, but that what matters to me most is not the sort of objectivity of the situation; it's the subjective experience of that if someone holds a particular belief. And the I don't think it's too strong a word to say the violence that is being done, irrespective of what the collective or even other objective standards.
So I totally agree with that and take that as a like I'd say that.
So I think that's a shared principle, isn't it? That you could say that would apply to some kind of religious minority in a different country that's been persecuted. Or I know a lot of people would not accept that, but I think...
No, I accept it. And,
I know you do, but I know a lot of people...
Just to back that, before I then try something else on another angle, like, I'd agree that, and my dad's not the best example, but my granddad and my great-granddad would have been, in terms of find me the benefit to their existence other than having children, but they had at least in the best way I can examine it, they had the freedom to say, here's what I believe, regardless of whatever's going on in my environment. They did have that capacity, and other people can be victimized as a result of it. That I accept that's a distinction between them, right? But, and I'm talking as fast as I think, so stop me if I go stupid. But do we have the freedom to think now? In the same way, if someone's got a gun to their head, fine, I accept that there's more drama there. There's definitely more violence imposed as a physicality to it. But isn't exactly what we're dealing with, not so much in what we're talking about in this conversation, but in what we've been dealing with in the other two as well, that's the direction we're going in. We're going in the direction where subconscious means and other means of coercion and compulsion are engineering us to not have the freedom to think, not even to desire the freedom to think, which is another fucking level deeper yet.
Yeah, and so tell me if this kind of represents that. This is how I see it, I think. On the one hand, there's a kind of belief about, does one want to have a vaccine or not, and the sort of violence of compelling someone against the will in that regard. And then layered on top of that is not simply about the vaccine per se, but what that represents in terms of the transfer of sovereignty and power, and and also all the other stuff that we've discussed about where that person might see that leading. So it's not
the precedent in what it will now lead to once you've crossed that boundary.
The precedent in what it will lead to, and the belief, not only it's again, it's not about, or it's only partly about the material composition of the vaccine and your body and the and the imposition of that. It's that actually, and it's like going back to that guy and what he was saying about it, that this actually represents a bigger issue, which is the precedent, but more than the precedent, the trajectory that is then complying to. So I think for me, whilst I don't think I need and don't see any medical value in that for me, and see, albeit slim possibility of risk, and because of what I know, the fact if any of those risks came to manifest, it would be like, oh my God, not only have I not done what I actually wanted to do, but in doing that now, I've something bad's happened to me, and it's burdening my life and my capacity for which is a bad psychological state to be in, I think, when you've lost that integrity and done that. So there's that sort of double layer on that. But then probably equally, if not even more so, is the fact that I have massive misgivings about what this acquiescence down this path of, for myself and for others people, acquiescing in that way means, in terms of the things that we've talked about, the new normal, all of that stuff, and so those two things can't be separated, but both of them in a sense are tied to the violence against integrity, because whilst I have no control over how the world evolves in terms of or I have the limited control that a single citizen in the United Kingdom has, which is pretty minuscule, but more so than some others. But in terms of my complicity in that, I do. So it's a kind of, I don't know, it's like a triple violation of integrity, of sort of bodily integrity, and but also sort of, it's not just bodily integrity. It's I don't know if the right word is political integrity or whatever. It's been forced to do something that is a harbinger of a social and political structure and system.
I think there's I think what we're all.
So it's a real violation, therefore, because it's making you. It's like.
Well, I think it's an order of magnitude greater than all the other.
And irrespective if I'm wrong, I think this is so important, because I know people are like, people go, and I might be wrong, they might be wrong, but it's about if you believe that, which I do, and I think I have good reason to. So it's really not about is that objectively the case or not, because we can argue till the cows come home whether it is or not.
I think
given someone believes that, how much of a violation is that to?
Yeah, I actually wouldn't. I'm just thinking about it now. I don't think I'd argue that it's that this, that bodily integrity, sovereignty, undermining. That it's anything new, right? And I think that's kind of contradicts some of the things I was saying before, but in the way I'm about to say, in the sense that what it is, and I think why it's so affecting, it's so potent, as we all know, visceral, is just this thing about this physical layer that is everything inside this is me, everything outside this is not me. I think the reason we resonate with that isn't because this is especially new, it's because it's just the next level in a long line of gradations against sovereignty, expansions into sovereignty, in the sense that from if you take in, and this isn't an idealistic primitivist sort of mindset, I'm just talking about the actual factual reality of human beings' evolution. Every single human being on this planet was at one time, and arguably still is, born completely sovereign and distinct from any other individual. No one individual or group of individuals should be able to override another individual. We know the political complexities for why that's not actually true, like in the sense of exactly a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. But when we've got states, when we've got the identifiable periods in history, whether it's people being removed from the land, or the tragedy of the commons type of thing, or industrial revolution, where it's not just, it's not remotely difficult to present those periods, those changes, in a way that isn't just like a natural evolution. It's clearly the degradation of the individual in order to serve a collectivist or a group or an elite intent, however you want to put it. And we've got identifiable, I don't know how many, somewhere between 5 and 10 moments since agriculture, and agriculture probably being the first one, where the nature of a human being in its naturally evolved state was completely wrenched from its existence, and it's forced to now evolve completely in a new cultural direction against its will as a result of elite, whatever you want to call it, but a more powerful structure than it itself could marshal against it, right? That's happened repeatedly, and these are the big tragedies of human history. Even agriculture, if you know enough about it, counts as one of these, right? And even though it might have had its benefits, it still counts as one of these negatives. Tragedy of the commons, industrial revolution, they're all there as these huge events that just completely take a species essentially and change it into something that's not quite what it was. This is just the last or the most recent in those events, but this one is where the line's gone from the encroachment of the larger scale organized empire into the tribal space, the encroachment into the family space, the encroachment into the child's education, whatever the thing is. This is the line now where it's literally it does get spiritual, in the sense that people who don't believe in the spiritual would back that word, like in this sense, like you're penetrating the actual permeable layer of the individual from that line of everything that's inside is me, everything that's outside isn't. I think that makes it different. Definitely makes it different, but I would actually argue, sort of counter to that, I'd argue that the other ones were all as big, especially agriculture. The other ones were all as big as this one. It's just that this one either crosses this different kind of, it's crossing a dimensional space into self, right? So in a way, I'm stretching things a little bit, I know, but it's almost like it's crossing a dimensional space, and therefore we instinctively are repelled by it, which is why I think this is why it's a human value, a human right at that level. But I think the truth is actually that we should have been as repelled by all those other encroachments, because they're all the same. They all amount to the same thing. They all amount to one individual being born on a speck of earth alongside other individuals that should hold no more influence than it does. Being brought to heel under certain systems of collectivist domination that have got progressively more powerful, completely unchecked in different ways, and this shows that you can argue about it's great that the empires all fell and the end of colonialism and everything. What the fuck does any of that mean when we've continued the exact same ascent into the penetration of the fucking human soul, basically? Like, we're at the bodily point now, So I think that that's what I would put forward as the argument for why not only it's so important, but people are going to be activated to have an opinion about this, to respond, to think about this in a way that they might not have been about other things, even if they've actually got quite a sort of a culturally conditioned, well, no, you've just got to do your bit for the hive kind of thing. I think still there's something subconscious about, wait, this is a line that many of these lines should never have been crossed, but this line absolutely shouldn't be crossed.
Yeah, and it speaks to the point. I don't know if it was before we started recording, but this thing that there's not a individualist position and a collectivist position to take necessarily here. That actually the threshold that's being crossed, the Rubicon that's being crossed, and it's not obviously it's not a it's not like something new under the sun. This has been a trajectory. It's just that, and I think we probably discussed this in the first episode, that this has come to provide this I think will be seen as the major historical moment where a transition was recognised that may well have been that was nascent and emergent prior to this in sort of many years, and will evolve into much more kind of concentrated forms. But that is that is what this represents, and I think people will probably find that difficult to, or not, I shouldn't say people, some people will find that difficult to accept, or may even in some respects find it uninteresting because they just do the job and they just live in the house and they just, you know what I mean? It's not a concern. It's a kind of like,
that's the dominant thing. The most people I've spoken to,
it seems too distant. It seems too. Yeah.
Well, they don't even have a basis for why it's a problem. Like,
but also I think there's probably that much sort of nihilism, or that.
Not in those people, surely.
With them,
it's just doing what they're told, and not to be condescending about it. But.
No. I guess nihilism in the sense that going back to that kind of end of history point. I think people are. I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is I think people are happy to sort of sleepwalk or half sleepwalk. Not quite sleepwalk because they're not totally unaware.
Yeah.
They're happy to kind of just wander into the brave new world of, and it seems kind of inevitable. And
I know people like that, but then I find that there's more people who are confused that you've got an issue with it. Like, that's what's been a surprise to me. Like, they're actually confused.
But is sometimes that confusion because they don't necessarily see the salience of the implications.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
It's like the guy, the book, and he was talking about the Google glasses being the line.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like the boiling frog thing, isn't it? And he was making that point, he was saying when he was younger he thought there was this kind of Manichean point with the marking of the beast where it'd be like clear in plain sight.
Yeah, this is Paul Kingsnorth in his book Confessions of an Environmentalist.
Yeah, and it was
the barcode moment is the
exactly. So the barcode moment being where when he was younger and he thought it would be a kind of simple moment where it's like, this is the threshold, now we're trying to be marked as a thing. Yeah. And one sort of point he was making was that actually, of course, it's much more subtle and less clear, and like for some people it was the internet, and he says and they said no, this is a trap. For some people it could be the smartphone. For him he felt like it was the Google glasses.
Which, for clarity, what he was saying is that it's the point at which technology becomes so incorporated into your existence and like almost like your body. At what point you are fused with the technology to the degree that you would say, I'm not doing that. And if that's your head being removed and stuck on a spine of your head and spine being stuck into a robot, or it's just putting a little healthy microchip on your head that could make your eyesight work better or whatever, everyone's got a line where they go, I'm not doing that.
And I guess what I'm saying is this kind of description of, okay, I guess how many people are actually you can say, okay, you now are being sort of tracked, you now have your biomedical data on this thing. This thing's probably going to expand. I just think many people shrug the shoulders at that. I think,
Yeah,
because
I think so.
for that point that I was saying before, because it's not only biopolitical in terms of what it is, it's biopolitical in terms of like, well, as long as the state's protecting life, and the other thing about the biopolitics thing is, and it links to the refugee point, there are benefits. It's a system of it's a system of margins of exclusion. In other words, if you carry a British passport, then you get access to the health service. You get the positives of the sort of state intervening in the maintenance and the augmentation of life, the management of the life process. If you're from a different country, you don't, and so of course they want to control the flows. It's like with migration, it's like with other things. They want to control the flows of biological matter. They want to control the flows of humans, of human beings and so on. So these are kind of tools to further refine and economize the system of control, which could also be called a system of regulation, which sounds less triggering,
Yeah.
But it's a system of population management. Make no mistake. And again, you can see that as sinister or as sort of less sinister, But it's making legible. It's seeing like a state. It's the James C. Scott thing. It's making legible the minutiae of managing a sort of biopolitical world order in a sense.
Yeah. So
I guess what I'm saying is, I think, I'm saying, I think we're saying, like, and aside from the bodily integrity with the vaccine, I'm on about the vaccine passport now, and the sort of digitization and the monitoring of individual biological systems, but seen on a population scale, and the ability to track those things and monitor those things and make
which
them
I want to make a point about that in a second.
Make them legible to various different agencies that may have an interest in them, and potentially private sector agencies like insurances and selling of your NHS data and blah 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 blah, all these things that I'm kind of, oh my god, this is the dystopian sci-fi future that we need to kind of try to sort of take a step back on. Certainly, talking about what's the Google, the barcode moment or whatever, this has been such an exponential growth in this, and I think, in a purposeful one. These desires have been in place within institutions. The discussion of vaccine passports as well predates COVID. Like, all these things have been ready to go because it services that, and one of the barriers to that is public perception and public will. So it's no surprise that these things then, and in a way, this is finishing off the conversation at the start around let's layer these things up. With the this is why people would go along with it, and the peer pressure and the and the stigmergy and the stuff. But then this is why these different responses have been implemented, because it aligns with various different objectives. And anyway, but. Yeah.
So with yes, I think it's important just to ground it. I loved everything you just said.
But sorry, I forgot to crown it off.
I loved everything you just said.
I know, I know, but I'm just saying. I want to say that people. But I think people see that as kind of inevitable and happy to do that. That's the bit that I was. Do what? Well, I guess I think when some of this is said, it seems sort of problematic to us, and to other people it doesn't. It's just a further expansion of the system of regulation that's been getting more and more intensified. And they go, well, yeah, of course we've got to control biological flows now because we're an interconnected world, and of course we've got to control human populations and flows because we can't, refugees and migrants and so on and so on. And so, yeah, of course we should be scanning our QR codes like when we're moving through these things. And what does it matter? Because I still, I'm still getting Netflix, and I'm still like,
yeah, exactly.
and I can still have my family.
The actual driving, the actual driving motivations for people's daily existence have changed now in the last 100 years, especially, but in the last 20 years. Like, if they're getting Netflix, like, it's not even, that wasn't even a silly statement you're making. If Netflix is there, that would be, that would actually be included. Tesco's, Netflix,
a livelihood,
and my car, and the capacity to go on holiday and spend some money at Christmas and blah blah blah, and all these other
And the regulation of any threats, like we were saying before, as to what, biosecurity is.
As long as I'm protected.
Protect the status quo, because I'm invested in the status quo.
Yeah.
It's the end of history. It all links back. It's the end of history. There is, there is no grander political project. There is no, there is no redemption.
But it is by definition.
There is no redemption.
At that point, it is the almost instantaneous amalgamation into a human hive of
and a nihilistic one. I think that's that's why I was saying nihilistic, because if there is no redemption, if death is the only kind of thing to be avoided in life, the thing to be sort of maximized in a very biological sense, or otherwise consumerist sense, which is vacuous, devoid of spiritual leadership, then I think that's why the people en masse are willingly able to accept those things, because it all makes sense within that framework.
But beyond even that self-directed meaning that it'd be lacking, once you've got that, what we just listed, the guy who's got his Netflix in his car and he's got his bits and pieces, and he becomes amalgamated into that hive, how much time, the will for liberty, the will to actually have anything more than that, is lost in a generation. So there's no more checks and there's no more barriers to power, essentially creating, and we're getting, this is as far off the fucking wall as I want to get, but it's not a stupid statement to make, that when you cross some of the boundaries that we're talking about here, you only need to boost forward a couple of generations to visualize a future where you've got the greatest aims of every megalomaniac from history, from Alexander the Great to Julius Caesar or whoever else, if they could have had that is level of complete control, where you end up with 90% of humanity essentially being cattle. And it's not, I don't think that's a bold statement, essentially being almost moronic compared to the level of awareness that still exists at this other higher class, this elite structure now, and everything else is, all the rest of the population essentially amount to, almost in the way that the sort of the idea of America as a consumer culture now, that's what they've introduced to the global economic order. They use shit, right? And that's kind of the precursor to this, that someone could just sit in a chair and get fat and eat shit. Not to say all Americans are fat or anything, but just to be a consumer in the stereotype sort of cliche sense.
A lot of them are. I mean.
Yeah, and we're catching up. But that, in a similar way that you look at that and just think, God, that's depressing. Well, the objective, I don't mean in a conspiratorial sense, in an agenda, but the objective of power would be moronic if it didn't utilize its level of awareness to say, right, 6 billion people, how are these people best utilized? Well, they're best utilized as being a hell of a lot more stupid than I am for a start, and orchestrating things. Yeah, I'm using words like orchestrate now. It's starting to sound really conspiratorial, but I'm just saying it's the natural order that any species, if it's got the wherewithal, the intelligence to be able to do it, would orchestrate the things that aren't the elements that aren't its own kin into a system that's going to perpetuate and ferment its own power or whatever, right? And as soon as you've removed the barriers, not the checks and balances barriers, but the will to even say I'm sovereign, as soon as you've done that, how fucking short a period could it be before everything's gone? Everything, human culture, it's just we've become literally a herd with really all the best aspirations of what humankind could have ever been. They still exist within this ridiculously small and extremely not particularly diverse contingent of humanity that's left behind. Basically power seekers, the people who've always, the elite, whatever pejorative term you want to put on the people who find themselves in that station for whatever reason they find themselves there. Optimistic. I've made, however, I think between us we've made kind of however much of a success of the point that it's important, right? And maybe I've gone a little bit off the wall with a lot of it, but
maybe I have as well.
But
I don't think we've convinced Mervis, that's for sure. If that was our objective,
Maybe,
I think Mavis is just
at
like,
the supermarket checkout.
what are these?
I'd just be like, no, you're not
crazy?
going, Mavis. Mavis, come back. You started this conversation, Mavis. No way. You said I can't wear a mask. You're gonna listen. You're gonna hear. You're gonna hear it all.
Right,
but I think it's the rub is like it's.
I have to
it's
accept.
important.
Let's just say this. I have to accept that like a huge swathe of people, and I'd probably use the word justifiably, would listen to this, and think these two are like sort of crazy. I mean, I'm being a little bit extreme, but and I have to accept that, and yet I have to, but yet what I want in return is for those other people to sort of accept our right and integrity to kind of have this. Because I think this is right, and there's plenty of people who would watch this and think it's right. Some would even think it's not right enough. If you know what I mean.
We're being fancy.
They'd be like,
I know people that would be bitching
people,
at me for being too moderate and mild in what I'm saying. Yeah.
But I know that I think if my assumption would be that the majority of people would just think this is. This is like here and here and here, and like. But
well, it's surely the distinction, the thing that
they won't get the connections necessarily, or even agree if they do get them.
But it comes down to whether or not this is why it's a sovereignty issue again.
Yeah,
it's like this is a massive deal to anyone who recognises sovereignty as a massive deal, and if you don't, if you've either been encultured to not do, or if you've got the Netflix and you've got the things you want that you're totally happy to just be homogenized into some blob of human meaninglessness. Not to shoot them down too much, but like it all depends on how much you value sovereignty, and that depends on what your particular interpretation of history is, combined with your instinctive desire to not be beneath another person who wasn't born with any more rights than you. Like, and we can all adopt a social contract and say, okay, I'm part of a community. I'll take certain hits. But that's very different. A lot of people coming together and saying, we're all going to do this as part of an agreed upon thing. That's very different to the Norman yoke. That's very different to to what we've got in British history, which is powerful patriarchs and successive waves of powerful patriarchs completely rolling over all sense of decency and individuality throughout history, without any, like I said before, without any apparent arrest of their movement forward whatsoever, because we end up, here we are, bodily sovereignty, we're at the line at which there's nothing after that. Basically the only line left to be crossed after this issue is metaphysical. We're literally going out of the dimension of physicality. We're talking about something spiritual, or the soul, which could be a complete pile of shit that doesn't mean anything as far as I know. So this is the one I can really, the hill I can die on. It's my fucking body. It's the line at which I begin and the world ends. How is that not important? Now that's the only reason I think a lot of people, like you said, many aren't thinking about it and won't give a shit. But I think a lot of the people who, I don't want to say matter, but a lot of the people, but I feel like saying it.
The others can just cross-vaccinate, the ones that matter.
Well, that's the choice made, isn't it? If someone can listen to these kinds of these kind of points and say like, yeah, I don't get it. Fine, I don't feel like trying to. Maybe you're right, maybe I'm wrong, but this is where I'm at, there's where you're at. And in terms of where I'm at and the perspective I'm looking out from, I believe the people who are on similar lines to be able to have that perspective, I believe they're probably thinking, many of them will be thinking along similar lines to the ones I was thinking on this week, where I'm saying like, oh, this is an issue, but how do I argue for this? What are the concrete arguments for this? It comes down to the ICU thing. It comes down to this thing of there are people gonna suffer as a result of your personal choices. And I think that, I don't know if it's worth sort of listing a few of those.
Definitely.
Or maybe just banging them up in text. I don't know. We could bang
them up in text.
Just bullet point 10 solid reasons, why it's not quite as simple as you choosing not to have your vaccine is going to make you be be clogging up the wheels of this otherwise efficient system that actually has had about 2 years to get ready for what doesn't even seem like a crisis in terms of what we were expecting originally. And we've got this tsunami reported today, from Boris, of cases that are about to come in. But from my limited in terms of I'm not an academic, limited reading of what what's it called? Omicron is doing is that it's, well, to use the direct quote from a friend of mine today, is it looks like a bit of a pussy, to be honest. Like, it's you've got insane amounts of spread, really potent spread, but what it's doing doesn't seem.
The funny thing is, this was the prediction of the, I'll call them the heterodox virologists, but it's, from what they were said, and I don't know because I've not studied it and gone to the original text, but there was plenty of people saying that's just what they do. That this is what we know about these things as phenomena in the world.
Yeah.
They progressively get attenuated in terms of the lethality and severity, but they get more contagious, and that's what evolution, at least, I've done my GCSE Darwin to know that, that's what you would expect based on, an organism that's trying to kind of maintain itself and reproduce itself. So all of these things were so predictable. That's the other thing, the other thing that needs to be said, and maybe we've said it in other episodes, is, and in fact, that guy says it in that article that you shared that we could post maybe at the end, because it's a good one. I think he says this anyway. The narrative doesn't stack up. The explanations that are being given do not stack up.
Yeah.
Now we can spend the next 50 podcasts speculating on why, or coming up with sort of theories, or trying to do what we were doing about let's layer this up, and and we can layer it, and I think we did a good enough job in just sort of responding to that immediate thing around how can there be sort of collusion or whatever, but it just doesn't stack up, right? So how can there be a justification for vaccine passports when it is gonna, the vaccinated can transmit. Seemingly, if you look at Israel and Ireland and what's the island called,
was it Skye or something?
It wasn't Skye, but anyway, many of the places where there's been the highest vaccination rate, there's also the highest infection rate. So what is the point in the vaccine passport?
I think this is critical.
There isn't one.
This had been
so you have to start. I think you have to start, or one has to start asking the question, if it doesn't stack up, there must be another explanatory variable.
If the medical explanation isn't a credible explanation, then what is the explanation?
Yeah, and even the official, only the medical one, but the official proclamation, which in this case claims to be based on the medical one. But there is no sense, there is no sort of coherent sense to it. So, there has to be another explanatory variable. A friend
of mine said today,
people can speculate on what that is, but I think most people would have to agree that there has to be another explanation.
And in closing, I'd just throw in that I was talking to a friend today who was kind of we're generally going over this sort of stuff, and one of the biggest things that sort of blocks for him in talking about it is he's like, well, why it's what would be the incentive? What's the incentive to vaccinate on this scale if it's pointless, if it's not even, if it's not really doing anything or whatever? Like, why, if there was the context of the conversation was that I was putting an authoritarian undertone to it, like that this is happening for a purpose, for a reason, whether it's organic. Why organic? I mean, whether it's an opportunistic relationship of state with organic circumstance, or whether it could be something more contrived. That I'm open to both. And he was saying, why would that contrivance, like why would everyone have to get vaccinated? And my response was that it's like, well, the vaccine. I mean, don't there's additional benefits for like low sort of the pharmaceutical industry for establishments within the system to do very well out of it for the same economic direction of wealth to keep moving in a certain respect, but the purpose, like you said, if it's not if it doesn't stack up that there's a medical reason behind it, well then what's the most visible other reason for it? What's the what is the that old adage, if you don't look at what something says, look at what it does, what is it achieving? Well, what it's achieving after the pharmaceutical industry have made a shitload of money and everything else that's gone on, what it's achieving is the complete normalization of vaccine passports and an identification system by which you can be, it's that fucking stupid thing where this starts sounding like you're talking about Bill Gates microchip bullshit. It's not that. You only have to look at China and be open to the possibility that the Chinese aren't fucking aliens. The state in China is no better or worse than the state as an institution anywhere, and that the only thing that hinders the state from trampling over the individual is the back push from the individuals gathered together, right? Now, I'm not making any bolder statement than
I think different states embed different ideologies
as a result of the culture they're born out of, and everything else, fine. But I'd say that I don't think it's a stretch to say that the biggest motivation of the state is to expand its power, and the biggest hindrance to that are the people. And that if the people are, as people in the UK especially are now, actively almost screaming and communicating their lack of any capacity to go against what they're being told to do, then the state will always keep expanding until it gets some pushback, and then it'll probably expand a little bit further until it's a bit too much pushback, and it's like, oh right, we found an equilibrium again between what you will demand and what I want to try and take from you. And I think that's the history of state versus the individual, personally. But the idea that people want to look at China and go, that's the Chinese, that's the communists, that's this, that, it's derivative of their culture, whatever. It's a variable, it's an element, some of that stuff, but that's nowhere near as important as the predominant presiding factor of how power operates.
Yeah.
And on that basis, I don't find it remotely difficult to imagine that the state that any other state anywhere around the world would if it could, if there's not enough pushback, replicate exactly the state of affairs that the Chinese government enforce on their people. And not necessarily even because the state are all evil and power grabbing and there's this consistent psychologically driven need for power over each other. I think there's definitely a lot of arguments around that stuff, but culturally from within that state infrastructure, more on the basis of being in keeping with their they'd be remiss in their duties to not expand that power in relation to other states. We've talked about this before, in relation to other states that are going to do that. If there's an organic situation, organic or otherwise, that allows states to expand power to become more like China, the ones that don't achieve some sort of level of authoritarian control over their populace are going to get deselected out of the garden of states that are now that have got that capacity to have more authoritarian, more centralized planning and all the rest of it. So in that situation, I don't think there's any leaps in anything that I've just said. And I think as soon as you're looking at it that way, and then you look back to our country and you say, oh, vaccine passports, regulation of the citizen to a degree that has never been palatable until this point in history, and now suddenly seems to be like absolutely fine, and something that, by the way, has been being pushed in different ways for decades and been pushed back at vehemently in different ways. And suddenly now the same thing that's being pushed in it, whether it's been in ID cards or whatever else, now it's totally palatable. Is it a coincidence that this is going to lead that would automatically lead to a cashless society and complete digital organization of everything? Is it a coincidence that would improve the efficiency of pulling value from workers and human beings in general to a way that there's no black market anymore. There's no capacity to get around any of that shit. I don't know, maybe, but when you've got all the variables that we're looking at, and the one identifiable end is vaccine passports, and the massive amount of asymmetric power that's going to provide to, let's face it, institutions that until really recently in history we would have mistrusted as a presiding kind of ethos, like to work by, and suddenly now, if you distrust them, you're the weirdo, you're the conspiracy theorist.
I mean, I don't know what I think of that anyway. Because like one thing that was coming to mind is that I'm directly experiencing, and in fact, someone sort of shared a video about this. You know, one institution that's really pushing all of this is the unions, like on the basis of, you know, health and safety. I'm not saying vaccine passports per se, but just in terms of, you know, the state or the government is getting all sorts of forces pushing on it that are, you know, outside of itself or semi-outside
clearly
of
not
itself.
part of some kind of
they're outside of it, and I can look at the unions and think, you know, probably the reason they're doing that is that they've kind of I don't like to say bought into the narrative, right? B, you know, it's one way that they can, you know, we've got a role, you know, because health and safety is a kind of safe space in a way. You know, they used to do wildcat strikes, you know, they used to, like, you know, hold capital to account and you know, ransom in a way. Now it's like all they can do is kind of play around in the sort of legal area where they can, this could be a breach of health and safety.
Just relevance is a reason for
relevance,
them to talk, to get involved.
Yeah, so that's just a sort of, you know, minor example that, you know, shows like how I think multifaceted this has become, and the various different like interests and forces kind of bearing on it.
But you'd agree, wouldn't you, that vaccine passports are the most
this is the other thing,
visible thing to gamble on as being the actual.
So, you know, I've been to conferences where you know, for example, the European Commission is looking at the challenge. You know, it comes back to this kind of threat and security thing and the maintenance of the status quo and the way in which, you know, these multiple threats exist in this really kind of chaotic and, you know, geopolitical, integrated global world that we live in. You know, looking at how a cryptocurrency is going to affect sort of the flows of criminal financial networks, and how, you know, and so I think there's, you know, we shouldn't underestimate the fact that I guess what I kind of slightly want to veer away from is this sort of you know, nefarious state actor sort of going for power, because, you know, sort of, I mean, it's not that I disagree with what you're saying in a way, but I think there are institutions that have mandates that vaccine passports or digital currency or whatever look like the perfect solution to the problem that they're looking at, which might be illicit financial flows. It might be, you know, the way in which you know, smuggling gangs are doing X, Y, and Z. It might be the way in which terrorist organisations are funding themselves. It might be, you know, and it's all very complicated and messy, because then on the other hand, you know, you've got HSBC sort of willingly accepting criminal money.
Yeah, and vitally,
so the system
just
is,
to add to
you know,
that,
and then
like,
you look at
the pirates, that idea of there being people, the nefarious, like, movement of money, the amount of tax, the amount of money that moves around in our culture, between people who would be impoverished if they didn't do it that way, like the amount of people that just don't pay tax, dodge tax, do whatever they're doing because they'd be impoverished otherwise. It's kind of one of the last bastions of actually maintaining some security and independence among the absolute lowest of the working class, and reining that in is the part of the thing again.
Part of it, right? Yeah, but
when I say part of the thing, part of the motivation for why you would want to digitize people's identities and have that level of. And I think it's really important when I'm talking about a vaccine passport being used in this way. Maybe I weren't clear. Like, it's that It's the
the
vaccine. The
infrastructure.
vaccine is the reason that justifies it and gets it through the door, and then the vaccine's irrelevant. You've got a QR code or whatever the circumstances are that have your digital ID and your financial circumstances tied to that.
Yeah.
The idea that we wouldn't be doing that. Anyone who wants to look at that and say, "Oh, you're talking about like Bill Gates microchip conspiracies," anyone who wouldn't look at that and say this is definitely going to happen, unless people actually probably bled to stop it happening. It's ridiculous to suggest it's not going to happen. It has to happen, because if it doesn't happen, efficiencies are going to be lost that the state can't possibly afford to be lost. So they're going to make it. It's going to come one way or another, I'd say.
I think that point around efficiencies, though, I guess, the only nuance I wanted to add is that I think, the state and the various institutions that have become more and more labyrinth and...
I can say the lizards, all the Jews. It's whatever.
have become more and more labyrinth and more kind of complex and compartmentalized and so on, are, I think, trying to manage a chaotic system in a way which is conservative, in the sense of conserving the status quo and the systems of controls that it needs to, or I mean, I'm not saying it needs to, but it overlays on this complicated global world of flows of people and flows of biological substances and flows of money and flows of capital and etc. Except flows of pollutants, etc. And it's constantly trying to make those things legible and constantly trying to then, once legible, impose structure and control over. And some of the people of the, like you said, the bottom of the poor that are trying to avoid taxation systems that would push them, over the line. And some of them are criminal networks and narco traffickers who might also have some kind of relationship with the CIA. And I guess the point, it's this sprawling kind of crazy fucking system.
Yeah.
And so I guess all I'm saying is, it doesn't take like a we'll create a digital currency and that'll give us more control. These things are all inbuilt into that, very simply, that seeing like a state logic. It's like it has, from the dawn of making people have surnames so that it can distinguish lineage in order to reap taxation and so on. And without wanting to sort of open another sort of big avenue, most people believe in some degree of taxation and some need for the state and so on. So it's kind of always about drawing those lines. But so I guess I don't necessarily believe that there is, in that regard, a kind of... One way of putting it is the conspiracy theory view of why these things are happening.
Well, you can't just say that. Define what you're interpreting as.
Well, let's say the kind of
What
stuff
is the
that
conspiracy
okay, well, so when I talk to people who's, David Icke predicted this would happen. David Icke said this would happen as well, and because of that, infer from that David Icke's explanation for why it's happening is the case. I don't think there's any necessary correlation, right? Because all those things would likely happen with alternative explanations for them, and it's not like a predictive theory in that respect. Do you know what I mean? So all those things can be happening for very other reasons. I think there will be many other much sort of more complicated reasons.
There could be theories that would count as a conspiracy theory for what lies behind things that don't involve David Icke or anything.
Yeah. I'm just giving an example. You asked me to give an example, I think, but and so. That's the thing. Like, the more you think, none of this is or not much of any of this is a conspiracy. Like in 2016, the EU were pushing for vaccine passports before COVID, right? In 20 whatever, Blair was trying to push for digital IDs.
I think Maggie Thatcher had, so there was something all the way back there, like.
Right,
on
yeah,
a superficial
maybe.
level, as far as I remember.
All digital currencies, like all these things. So I mean, all that that COVID's doing is it's providing that crisis as an opportunity. It's providing a justification to move some of these agendas forward, and the agendas are not you know, whether they're good or bad probably depends where you sat and depends. I certainly don't think they necessarily, or even on aggregate, driven by malign intent. I think there are these, as I've said, in just those small cases, people thinking from a governance perspective and from that kind of status quo control perspective, and from the different threats and hazards that are arising as a result of new technologies and new things that are happening in the world, like, you know, the risk of bioterrorism and the risk of this, and they're all analysing these things and they're saying, oh well, you know, if we had this, and if we're, you know, they're seeing like a state thing, if we're able to control this domain by observing this and regulating this and so on. So I think these kind of systems of control emerge out of that. But I think your point around the sort of progression from the agricultural revolution, what is the impact of this trajectory on the individual sort of Homo sapien, and when are people going to decide to kind of draw the line and get off the train? Because yeah, I think the logic of that, the sort of technocratic, you know, biosecurity, biopolitical, all these kind of terms that are pointing towards what's going on, are not conducive to a world that, you know, I would have thought most people want to live in.
Yeah, and you can step outside that kind of narrative of the oppressor and the aggressor, and the, you know, mankind being brought to heel under the boot of the elite and all the rest of it, and just when you're talking about where you draw the line, it doesn't have to be about fighting some battle and overthrowing something and going back to agriculture or whatever else it is. It's just recognizing wherever that line is for you, that you want to push back at, because your pushback isn't necessarily you're making a statement that I'm going to overthrow all power, I'm an anarchist, or whatever. Well, some might be, like, not necessarily. All it really is you saying, I'm communicating to you the point at which I'm going to start pushing back, right? Because that actually is the negotiation between the citizen and the state that can end up. A lot of it is a negotiation, you know. It can be like, the forces push until there's an equilibrium point of the potency on either side, and then this is where they are. Perhaps for a generation, perhaps for 1,000 years, you know. Like, so, at what point are you going to choose the line and say, oh, whether it's bodily sovereignty or whatever, and say, okay, this is the line that I'm not going to be pushed back from, and just by standing there, not starting a revolution, just by standing there, not complying, making the appropriate statement, might be one of the most important votes that's ever been cast in mankind, like in terms of where we end up in terms of cultural norms, on the basis of how much has changed in the last 30, 40 years, especially the last 15 years, information revolution, like where we are going to be, where we are when the dust settles from this fucking crazy 25 years, where we're going to be, short of there being something beyond our comprehension that comes after, where we're going to be is probably where we're going to stay for a long time, or some version of it. Whatever we're doing 50 to 100 years from now very possibly might be defined by what's happening right now. And the relationship, the negotiation between the citizen and the state, or the individual and the collective, may have been more acutely defined in this period, maybe this 6 months, than any other time. I don't think that's, maybe that's a bold statement, but it's definitely not ridiculous. It's definitely something that can be defended. So to choose where that line is,
undoubtedly an inflection point. It's undoubtedly, it's where time speeds up and the sort of butterfly type of effect comes into play. Small changes in these periods of intensity have broad implications, and whereas huge efforts in other periods have
and you don't need to fall in. You don't need to do a specific thing that people are ideologically getting behind. You just need to really believe in where your line is. Set your line and say, okay, that's where my line. Oh, we haven't reached my line yet. I'm in line, like you were saying. I'm Netflix, whatever it is. And maybe not to be disdainful about that. Maybe people are just saying, no, actually, I'm a team player to the degree that I'm not bothered about individuality and bodily sovereignty. And I just there could be reasons why someone is prepared to have the bodily sovereignty completely compromised for the greater good, for the collective ideal that they've got. Fine, then your line is somewhere different.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with people drawing their line wherever it is. I think
but I'm not sure there are many collective ideals, and that's the point I was making earlier about the fact that I believe the baseline is a form of sort of nihilism. I'm not judging anyone for that. I mean, I think that's the cultural condition that we live in late stage capitalism now. It's that what I was talking about in terms of the main objectives or things that we expect of politics is simply to maintain our levels of consumption and extend our lives and manage those flows that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, whatever defines your line, all I'm saying is I'm not in any way suggesting people should listen to anyone. I just think the only tragedy is if to look back and say like, oh, I didn't actually just choose my line. I didn't choose the line I wouldn't be pushed back from, kind of thing. Like there are a lot of people who would say that this line is the big deal and then just don't, the bodily sovereignty issue, and then not get on that line. Wherever it is, I think it's fine for everyone to make their own decision, but just think it through, make your decision about where you think it matters. And if you don't think it matters, fine, don't do anything about it. But there's got to be.
But don't put you and your kids in prison.
Just don't put me and my kids in prison. If you choose a line that's after that, otherwise, I'll get you on the back of the revolution.
After the jailbreak.
I'll be in my dinghy in the sea, capsizing in Calais. Well, so.
How long was that? About 4 hours.
It's 4 hours. 2 hour. I'd pause it to go. Let's just